When it comes to video games, there are only a select few titles that can truly be called timeless. Games that transcend generations, surviving long after their original release and continuing to find new audiences decades later. A while ago, I talked about The Last of Us and how that franchise has now spanned multiple console generations. Games like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas have achieved a similar level of immortality, remaining just as beloved today as they were when they first launched. Very few games ever reach that status. Last year during my Mortal Kombat Takeover, I covered Mortal Kombat 3 and talked about how there were essentially 3 different versions of the same game. But one comment in that video stuck out with me. 3 versions. Wait until he hears about Street Fighter 2. And honestly, they weren't kidding. Because while Mortal Kombat had a few revisions, Street Fighter 2 practically turned releasing new versions into an art form. Over the years, Capcom would release update after update, revision after revision, creating one of the most confusing family trees in gaming history. But there was a reason for it. Street Fighter 2 wasn't just another fighting game. It was the fighting game that changed everything. It sparked an arcade phenomenon, created countless imitators, and helped define an entire genre that is still thriving today. Welcome to episode 2 of the Street Fighter Takeover. Today, we're taking a look at the game with over 700 versions, Street Fighter 2.
Let's get going.
Disgrace to your art.
Sure you can!
You ready for this?
Drop the knife! Face the might. Worthless.
Imagine this, no gun, no knife. It's a one-on-one, son.
To those who know me, welcome back. To those who don't, welcome to the channel. I am the Retro Phantom, and here I create deep dives and retrospectives on the games that help make our childhoods and lives great. Right now, we're in the early stages of the Street Fighter Takeover, covering the entire history of Capcom's legendary fighting game franchise, especially with the new Street Fighter movie on the horizon. If you enjoyed this video and want to follow the journey, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you'd like to support the channel, the best way to do so is by liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. It helps tremendously with the YouTube algorithm and helps smaller creators like me continue to grow. And trust me, if you never looked into Street Fighter 2 before, you're probably about to have the same reaction I did when I discovered just how many versions of this game actually exist. So with that said, let's dive into this. Before we jump into Street Fighter 2, let's do a quick recap for anyone who may be joining this series for the first time. The story of Street Fighter begins with Capcom and the game designer Takashi Nishiyama. Prior to joining Capcom, Nishiyama worked at iRhythm, where he helped create Kung Fu Master, a game heavily inspired by martial arts films such as Enter the Dragon and Game of Death. When he joined Capcom, he wanted to take those martial arts inspirations even further. In 1987, Capcom released the original Street Fighter. The game introduced players to Ryu and Ken, 2 martial artists competing in a world tournament against fighters from around the globe. Despite its innovations, the original Street Fighter wasn't a major success. The controls were awkward, the special moves were difficult to perform consistently, and many of the ideas hadn't yet reached their full potential, but the foundation had been laid. A few years later, Capcom would experiment with the Street Fighter name again through Street Fighter 2010, a futuristic action platform released on the NES. While the game itself wasn't necessarily terrible, it had very little to do with the fighting game that players had come to know. It became one of the strangest entries in the franchise and showed that Capcom still hadn't quite figured out what Street Fighter was supposed to be. If you like the complete story behind both of those games, feel free to check out my previous Street Fighter retrospectives after this video. So now we are here today. The story behind Street Fighter 2 actually begins with an ending. Shortly after the release of the original Street Fighter in '87, director Takashi Nishiyama was approached by a headhunter and offered an opportunity to leave Capcom for a nearby studio known as SNK. Nishiyama accepted the offer and wouldn't be leaving alone. Joining him was planner Hiroshi Matsumoto, along with much of the original Street Fighter development team. If you watch my Street Fighter retrospective, you'll remember that Matsumoto played a major role in helping shape the game's characters and story concepts alongside Nishiyama. Together, they wanted Street Fighter to be more than just a martial arts game. They wanted distinct fighters with their own personalities and backgrounds. The problem was, many of their ambitions were limited by the realities of game development in the late 80s. One of Nishiyama's biggest regrets involved the roster itself. While Ryu and Ken would go on to become two of gaming's most iconic characters, the original vision called for far more playable characters. In an interview, Takashi Nishiyama would later say, "I think the most regrettable experience of the game was the fact that, we had all these ideas for coming up with different playable characters that we wanted to put into the game, but due to budget concerns, scheduling concerns, and whatnot, eventually that got whittled down to just having Ryu and Ken in the game, and I would have loved to have more playable characters, but unfortunately, we were only able to put in just the two of them." The development team also struggled with technical issues behind the scenes. According to Matsumoto, one of the biggest challenges came from trying to teach a programmer who had little experience in making video games. As Matsumoto recalled, the most difficult aspect of making that game, as far as I'm concerned, was the fact that the main programmer wasn't originally a game programmer. I don't think he'd come to Capcom as an official employee, but had been dispatched from another company. And he was a systems engineer, not a game programmer, so he had no idea how to make games. So I think the toughest hurdle came from trying to communicate with him and trying to teach him how to make games, because no matter how he tried to explain it, he just didn't seem to understand even the most basic concepts. Despite these challenges, the team continued experimenting with ideas that would eventually become defining features of the game. One of those experiments involved the now infamous pressure-sensitive arcade cabinet. Matsumoto even recalled future Capcom legend Yoshiki Okamoto taking an interest in the project despite not officially working on it. According to Matsumoto, Okamoto had actually taken interest in the Street Fighter project, even though he wasn't directly involved in it. He had been interested enough in Street Fighter that he had been involved in some of the discussions regarding the pressure sensor that we use in the arcade cabinet, which players would hit to generate weak, medium, or strong attacks. I remember one day he wanted to test how that would work, and we ended up making a prototype of that sensor using a rubber band and a button. And we both ended up testing how the pressure will work by banging it a bunch of times, so we both ended up with scratches on our fists. Although Street Fighter introduced concepts that would eventually help define the fighting game genre, the finished product was far from the original creator's vision. Character movements felt stiff, special moves were difficult to perform consistently, and the roster was a fraction of what Nishiyama had originally intended. Ironically, these frustrations would end up laying the groundwork for the future, because when Nishiyama, Matsumoto, and much of the Street Fighter team left Capcom for SNK, they didn't leave those ideas behind. And while Capcom would retain ownership of the Street Fighter name, many of the people who created it were now working for the competition. While two of the franchise's most important creators walked away, one key figure remained at Capcom: Yoshiki Okamoto. If you recall from the previous episode, Okamoto had already shown interest in Street Fighter during its development. By the late 1980s, he had been promoted to producer and was looking for ideas for Capcom's next major project. Around this time, Okamoto became fascinated with the success of beat-em-up games, particularly Double Dragon 2. He liked the concept of street gangs battling their way through city environments, but felt the execution left room for improvement. In his mind, Capcom had the talent and resources to create something bigger, faster, and more visually impressive. At the same time, Capcom's sales division wanted a sequel to Street Fighter, so naturally, those two ideas began to collide. Working alongside designer Akira Nishitani, better known by the nickname Nin Nin, development began on a project internally known as Street Fighter 89. And yes, that was actually the name. In fact, Capcom even showcased the game under that title at trade shows. If you look at surviving promotional material from that period, you'll find arcade flyers proudly displaying the Street Fighter 89 logo. Now, when most people hear Street Fighter 89, they probably imagine an early version of Street Fighter 2, but that's not what it was. If we look at the promotional artwork, the concept becomes pretty clear. Instead of one-on-one martial arts matches, the game focused on multiple playable characters fighting gangs throughout the city. The advertisement highlights different fighting styles, special attacks, throws, and wrestling-inspired moves such as the flying pile driver. Rather than a world martial arts tournament, the focus was on surviving brutal street battles against large groups of enemies. The advertisement itself read, 3 different fighters, each with their own unique special techniques, battle against gangs throughout the city, using 8-direction joystick and 2 buttons to perform weak, medium, and strong attacks, throws, backdrops, and powerful finishing moves such as a flying pile driver. Fight your way through the city and rescue your kidnapped girlfriend. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice something immediately. There's no mention of a world tournament, no mention of Ryu, no mention of Ken. Instead, the focus is on fighting gangs, rescuing kidnapped women, and battling through city streets. In other words, this really wasn't Street Fighter. It was a beat 'em up. And the further the development progressed, the more obvious it became. According to the developers, the original plan was to feature Ryu and Ken as the main protagonists. However, as the game's story and setting evolved, that idea was eventually abandoned. A completely new cast was created, along with a new storyline involving a city overrun by gangs and the kidnapping of a young woman. Arcade operators who saw the game reportedly felt the same way. While they liked what Capcom was building, many believed it had very little in common with the original Street Fighter. Capcom ultimately agreed. Street Fighter 89 was renamed before the release and launched under a new title, Final Fight. In an Edge magazine article, Noritaka Funimazu, who we'll get to know soon, spoke on Capcom at this time, saying, "It was 13 years ago, 1989, and Capcom, under pressure from its US branch, decided to start work upon a follow-up of its mediocre 87 beat-em-up Street Fighter. Funimazu-san himself was unsure. The first Street Fighter was not a success, but when everybody forgot about it, the fighting game started to become popular in the US, so we were asked to make a sequel. When we presented Final Fight to the US, they asked us to make fighting games our priority. I felt uneasy. I mean, when we finished Final Fight, they told us we were wrong, that it would never succeed in the US. Final Fight became a huge success. It sold more than 80,000 units in the US. Despite Final Fight's success, Capcom still had a problem. They still hadn't delivered the Street Fighter sequel that the sales division had originally requested. By this point, however, Capcom had assembled a dream team of developers. As Yoshiki Okamoto rose through the company during the late 1980s, he began surrounding himself with talented creators he believed could build the next arcade phenomenon. While working on Forgotten Worlds, Okamoto brought together artists Akira Yasuda and game designer Akira Nishitani and Capcom veteran Noritaka Funimasu. Together, they would become one of the most influential developers in the company's history. Fresh off the success of Final Fight, the team immediately shifted their focus towards creating a true sequel to Street Fighter. According to those involved, the development process became a melting pot of ideas. Okimoto, Yasuda, Funimazu, and many others constantly pitched new concepts and ideas, while Akira Nishitani served as the person responsible for bringing those ideas together into a cohesive game. As development progressed, the team began asking a simple question: what made people keep putting quarters into arcade machines? For Okamoto, the answer wasn't found in the computer-controlled enemies, it was found in competition. In a later interview, he explained, Back in the day, people at the arcades weren't happy. Space Invaders was popular and cost 10 yen to play. Developers were happy and arcade operators were happy, but players weren't happy because the game didn't last very long. So we thought really hard about what would make everybody happy. Okamoto will go on to explain that Final Fight had already experimented with the cooperative multiplayer, but the team realized there was still a problem. If players lost against a computer, they often blamed the game's difficulty. Okamoto recalled, but if players were competing against each other, whether they won or lost would be up to them. So we're thinking that could take out the frustration. That single idea will become the foundation for Street Fighter 2. Not a game about beating the computer, a game about beating the person standing next to you. The team knew one thing from the start. They couldn't simply make another Street Fighter. They had to make the Street Fighter that the original game was trying to be. If the first Street Fighter was a game built on problems, then Street Fighter 2 would be a game built on solutions. For all of the planning that went into Street Fighter 2, one of the most important features wasn't planned at all. It was an accident. During the development, Capcom was trying to solve one of the biggest problems from the original Street Fighter. Special moves such as the Hadouken or the Shoryuken were notoriously difficult to perform consistently. Players often felt as though they had entered the command correctly, only for it to fail. To address the issue, the development team loosened the input window, making special attacks more reliable and easier to execute. At the same time, programmers implemented a feature that allowed players to cancel portions of a normal attack's animation by immediately inputting a special move. The intention wasn't to create combos. The intention was to simply make the controls feel better, but during development, something unexpected happened. While testing the game, developers discovered that players could land a normal attack and immediately transition into a special move before the opponent had time to recover. Rather than being separate actions, the attacks would connect together as one continuous sequence. In other words, players could chain attacks together. And from here, the combo system had been born. In a later interview, Funimazu recalled discovering the mechanic completely by accident. While I was making a bug check during the car bonus stage, I noticed something strange. Curious. I tapped the sequence and we saw that during the punch timing, so I thought this was something impossible to make useful inside a game, as the timing balance was so hard to catch, so we decided to leave the feature as a hidden one. The most interesting thing is that this became the base for future titles. Later we were able to make timing more comfortable and the combo into a real feature. In Street Fighter 2, we thought if you got the perfect timing, you could place several hits, up to 4 I think. Then we managed to place 8. A bug? Maybe.
Cool, here we are, the source of all Street Fighter strategy, Capcom headquarters in Northern California. Okay, so you played Street Fighter 2 Turbo on the Super NES system, or the Special Champion Edition on the Sega Genesis system. You've gotten pretty good. But since you're a cut above most players, being pretty good doesn't cut it. To be the vet, you could have spent a fortune you don't have learning the moves on your own in the arcades. Or you could have spent time you don't have figuring out the moves off the printed page. But you've decided to check out the strategy video instead. Because we're not just going to show you combinations and strategies for both the Super NES and the Sega Genesis systems. We're going to find out ways to make you think like a winner by talking with experts on Street Fighter strategy. Like this guy, Tomohiro. Tomo's #1 ranked Street Fighter player in the US, and he's created most of the combos and strategies on this tape, and we're going to meet him. Let's go. As you can see, they weren't exactly expecting this. You can learn the basic moves that we'll be talking about by reviewing the manual that came with the game. The characters you'll be seeing on screen appear in the same order in the manual. Cool. By the way, these combos and strategies are for intermediate and advanced players. But with a little practice, anyone can learn from them, no matter what level you are at right now. So don't be discouraged if you don't get this stuff on the first try. Because hey, you can always rewind this video and review, right? You can always rewind this video and review, right? Check out some of this introductory stuff while I dig up an expert.
What's fascinating is that Capcom never intended for combos to become a major mechanic. In fact, earlier fighting games were designed around individual attacks. Players would throw a punch, wait for the animation to finish, then perform another move. Street Fighter 2 accidentally broke that formula. When the game had reached arcades, players quickly discovered which attacks could be linked together and began experimenting. Before long, competitors were creating their own strategies and finding new ways to maximize damage. Capcom could have removed this mechanic. Instead, they embraced it. Not bad for a mistake. So everything the team learned from the first Street Fighter, everything they learned from Final Fight, everything they learned from the arcade business, it all came together in one single project. And on March 7th, 1991, the immortal classic was born. For my Street Fighter 2 retrospective, I thought about doing something different compared to my other videos and how I usually tackle video games because, in all honesty, Street Fighter 2 is not a game, it's a franchise. Keep in mind, I can count on hand about 8 different ways to play Street Fighter 2, and while making this video, I ran into thinking which is the right version to play. I mean, they even have a remake in 2008, which is super rare to get, so let's dive into this. When you look at the original Street Fighter compared to Street Fighter 2 World Warrior, you already see a massive improvements right out the gate. For starters, the music is significantly better thanks to the composers Yoko Shimomura and Iso Abe. Many of these tracks would go on to become some of the most recognizable themes in gaming history. Continuing on, the biggest upgrade itself is the roster. In the first game, you were limited to just Ryu and Ken as playable characters. This go around, players can choose from Ryu, Ken, E Honda, Blanca, Guile, Chun-Li, Zangief, and Dasim. These 8 fighters make up the playable roster in the World Warrior, and each one comes with their own fighting style, personality, bio, and ending. Don't worry, we'll get into those later in the video. On top of the 8 playable fighters, the game also introduces 4 boss characters. First up is Balrog, who essentially replaces Mike from the original Street Fighter. After him comes Vega, followed by Street Fighter's original boss, Sagat, and finally, mastermind behind the tournament himself, M. Bison. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that these 4 bosses are not playable in the World Warrior. If you ever wanted to play as them, you're going to have to wait for some of the later versions of Street Fighter 2, which we'll be covering soon in the video. The next major upgrade is the overall scope of the game. In the original Street Fighter, players traveled across 5 countries: Japan, the United States, China, the United Kingdom, and Thailand. The World Warrior expands that roster of locations by introducing the Soviet Union, Brazil, India, and Spain, while also bringing back the original countries from the first game except for the UK. So compared to the original release, the game has already expanded dramatically. We've gone from 2 playable characters to 8, and from 5 countries to 9. Now let's actually talk about the gameplay. Just like the original game, you'll select a fighter and you'll battle your way through the roster before eventually taking on the 4 boss characters. Along the way, you'll also encounter bonus stages designed to break up the action and give players a chance to rack up points. The first bonus stage has players destroying a stack of bricks, while the second one has you absolutely demolishing a Lexus LS400. Ironically, the car destruction serves as a callback to Final Fight, which features a similar bonus stage of beating a car into scrap metal. In both challenges, players are given 40 seconds to completely destroy the object using nothing but fists and feet. Every successful hit awards points towards your overall score, while clearing the challenge quickly rewards additional points based on the remaining time. And if you're skilled enough to complete it flawlessly, the game rewards you with a massive perfect bonus on top of everything else. The game still uses the now iconic 6-button layout consisting of light, medium, and heavy punches alongside light, medium, and heavy kicks. Like the original Street Fighter, movement is handled through the 8-directional joystick, which allows players to walk, crouch, jump, block. The difference is that everything feels significantly smoother and more responsive than before. When it comes to the actual fighting, there are a surplus of upgrades. For starters, special moves are much easier to perform. In the original Street Fighter, there were times when it felt like you entered the command correctly and the game simply decided to not cooperate. Here, the inputs feel far more reliable. If I missed a Hadouken or Shoryuken, it usually felt like it was my mistake than the game's. The controls overall are more fluid. The original Street Fighter often felt stiff and awkward, whereas Street Fighter 2 gives players much more freedom in how they move and attack. Characters feel faster, they're more responsive, and generally more enjoyable to play. Another major addition is the throw system. If you get close enough to an opponent, you can grab them and launch them across the screen. These throws are surprisingly powerful, often removing a significant chunk of a character's life bar. Some characters can even grab opponents out of the air and slam them back to the ground. There are also hold attacks that allow fighters to grab an opponent and repeatedly beat the crap out of them before releasing them. Considering how much damage these attacks do, it's easy to see why throws became such an important part of high-level play. The environments also receive upgrades. While the stages aren't fully interactive, several of them feature breakable objects. During Ken stage, players can knock over and destroy barrels. On Guile stage, crates can be smashed apart during the fight. These details don't change the gameplay much, but they make the world feel more alive and help each location stand out. The next thing we need to talk about is the combo system, which, as I mentioned earlier, was completely accidental. While playing, I found myself naturally linking attacks together without even realizing it. A jump attack into a strong punch and then immediately transitioned to a special move before the opponent had a chance to recover. What started as a bug quickly became one of the most important mechanics in fighting game history. Combos also tie directly into another mechanic introduced in Street Fighter 2. The dizzy or groggy system. If a player takes enough damage in a short amount of time, they'll become stunned, leaving them completely vulnerable for a few seconds. During this state, stars spin around their head while they're unable to defend themselves. This often leads to bigger combos and can completely swing the momentum of a match. When all of these systems come together, the smoother controls, the stronger special moves, throws, combos, and dizzy mechanics, you begin to understand why Street Fighter 2 felt so revolutionary in '91. It wasn't just a sequel to Street Fighter, it was the game the original Street Fighter wanted to be. Now this game continues the multiplayer concept introduced in the original Street Fighter, but this time around it feels much more important to the overall experience. Just like in the first game, if you're playing through the arcade mode and the second player decides to join in, the game immediately switches to a head-to-head match. The winner stays in the tournament while the loser is sent packing. It's a simple concept, but it's easy to see why this became such a huge part of arcade culture. Instead of fighting a computer all day, players could constantly challenge each other to see who was actually the better fighter. Of course, if you don't feel like interrupting somebody's arcade run, there's also a dedicated versus mode that lets two players battle it out as much as they want. One feature I thought was pretty interesting was the handicap option. By adjusting the attack level for each player, the game can increase or decrease the amount of damage a fighter deals. That means if one player is significantly better than the other, you can level the playing field and create a more competitive match. It's a small feature, but one that makes sense when you remember how popular this game became among friends and rivals. Now, one thing I found funny while playing is just how many ways the game lets you customize your experience. Players can adjust their controller layout, remap punches and kicks, switch between stereo and mono audio, and even access music and sound sets to listen to the game's soundtrack and sound effects. For a game released in the early 90s, there are actually a decent number of options available. The biggest setting, however, is the difficulty selection. Street Fighter 2 allows you to choose from 8 different difficulties ranging from 0 to 7. Now sure, you can beat the game on the easiest setting if you want to, but much like some of the other games from this era, the developers weren't actually impressed by that accomplishment. In fact, if you clear the game on lower difficulties, Street Fighter 2 will essentially tell you to come back when you're ready for a real challenge. Character endings can be locked away, and if you rely too heavily on continues, the game may skip over your proper ending altogether. To see the endings the game has to offer, you need to beat M. Bison on a higher difficulty and prove that you actually mastered the game. And if you're somehow good enough to beat the entire game on the hardest difficulty without losing a single match, you'll be rewarded with a special bonus screen featuring the entire cast and boss characters. It's a fitting reward because after spending all this time fighting through the World Warrior tournament, the real stars of Street Fighter 2 aren't the stages, the bonus rounds, even the gameplay. It's the characters themselves, which finally brings me to the roster. Starting with the leading man himself, Ryu. For explaining these characters, I'm using information from the game's manual alongside the endings. According to the manual, Ryu is a student of Master Shenlong and has devoted his entire life to mastering his fighting skills. His goal is simple: travel the world, challenge strong opponents, and continue growing as a martial artist. The mindset is perfectly reflected in his ending. After defeating M. Bison and winning the World Warrior Tournament, Ryu doesn't stick around for a celebration or even attend the awards ceremony. Instead, he immediately leaves and returns to his training. Honestly, Ryu reminds me a little bit of Goku, if it's fair to say. Not because they're exactly the same character, trust me, they're not, but because both are completely obsessed with self-improvement and becoming stronger. They're not chasing fame, money, or recognition. They're chasing the next challenge. That's what makes Ryu work so well as Street Fighter's main protagonist. He's not just interested in glory. He doesn't care about trophies. He simply wants to know that he was strong enough to emerge victorious. Next up, we have another returning fighter from the original game, Ken Masters. Much like Ryu, Ken also trained under Master Shenlong. However, while the two share similar techniques, their personalities couldn't be more different. Where Ryu is calm, disciplined, and patient, Ken is more confident, prideful, and occasionally arrogant. Think of him as the complete opposite side of the same coin. According to his biography, Ken had spent the last year relaxing on the beach with his girlfriend Eliza, allowing his fighting skills to deteriorate somewhat in the process. It isn't until the World Warrior Tournament begins that his competitive spirit has been reignited. Ken also loves reminding people that he's one of the best fighters in the world. He enjoys competition and wants to prove that he can stand above anyone else, including Ryu. Gameplay wise, he's nearly identical to Ryu, just as he was in the original Street Fighter. Both fighters share many of the same moves and serve as excellent beginner-friendly characters. After defeating M. Bison, Ken's ending reveals what truly matters to him. Rather than continuing his journey in search of another fight, he reunites with Eliza and walks off into the sunset with her by his side. It's a fitting conclusion for his character. While Ryu immediately returns to training, Ken returns to the person he loves. No matter how important a tournament ends, Ken always seems to find his way back to Eliza. Honestly, the fact that his birthday is Valentine's Day tells you pretty much everything you need to know about him. Now let's get into the new characters, starting with E. Honda, whose full name is Edmund Honda. Like Ryu, Honda hails from Japan, but instead of practicing traditional martial arts, his fighting style revolves around sumo wrestling. His physical appearance was heavily inspired by Chiyono Fuji, one of the most famous yokozuna or grand champions in the history of sumo wrestling. It's another example of Street Fighter II pulling inspiration from real-world fighters when designing his cast. According to his biography, Honda enters the World Warrior Tournament with a simple goal: prove to the rest of the world that sumo wrestling is not only a legitimate fighting style, but one of the strongest forms of combat on the planet. What I like about Honda is that his story is built entirely around pride in his craft. He isn't seeking revenge, money, or world domination. He simply wants respect for the sport he dedicated his life to. His ending reinforces this idea. After defeating M. Bison, Honda enjoys the rewards that come with becoming a champion, but much like Ryu, he ultimately returns to training. For him, becoming stronger and representing sumo wrestling will always be more important than fame. Overall, Honda's story is one of dedication, discipline, and earning respect for the one thing he loves most. Next up, we have Blanca. And unlike Honda, Blanca's story is one giant mystery. According to the manual, very little is known about his past. Most of his life has been spent surviving the jungles of Brazil, where he became known for his wild appearance, animalistic behavior, and ability to generate electricity through his body. Within a year of the tournament, stories began spreading about a strange green fighter capable of shocking opponents with over 1,000 volts of electricity. As for his design, Blanca drew inspiration from several manga characters. One influence was Anabi, a fair warrior raised by lions from Jungle King Tar-chan. His more recognizable traits, such as sharp teeth and wild appearance, were also influenced by Gorilla Man from Tiger Mask. What makes Blanca interesting is that despite looking like a monster, his story is surprisingly emotional. After defeating Bison, a woman suddenly appears and calls him Jimmy. At first it seems completely random, but she soon reveals that Blanca is actually her long-lost son. Years earlier, Jimmy had been lost following a plane crash in Brazil and was presumed gone forever. The proof comes from the anklet Blanca wears. The woman recognizes it immediately because it was a gift she had given her son years ago. With that revelation, one of Street Fighter II's biggest mysteries is finally solved. Underneath the green skin, sharp teeth, and electric attacks is a simply lost child who ultimately found his way back home. It's honestly one of the most heartfelt endings in the entire game, especially for a character who looks like he should be one of the villains. Now we head to the military side of the roster with Guile. According to his biography, Guile is a former member of an elite special forces unit whose story revolves around one thing: revenge. 6 years before the World Warrior Tournament, Guile and his partner Charlie were captured while operating in Thailand. Although the two eventually escaped, Charlie lost his life during the ordeal. Ever since then, Guile carried that loss with him, waiting for an opportunity to bring Charlie's killer to justice. That opportunity arrives with the World Warrior Tournament. As for his design, Guile was specifically created to appeal to Western audiences. His iconic appearance was heavily inspired by characters from JoJo Bizarre Adventure, particularly Jean-Pierre Polnareff, who influenced the famous flat-top hairstyle, as well as Rudolf von Stroheim. What I like most about Guile's story is that it isn't really about defeating Bison, it's about what happened afterwards. After winning the tournament, Guile finally gets the chance he's been waiting years for. Bison is beaten, vulnerable, and completely at his mercy. For a moment, it looks like Guile is ready to finish the job and take his revenge. Then his wife and daughter appear. They remind him that killing Bison won't bring Charlie back. And honestly, that's what makes this ending work. Instead of allowing revenge to consume him, Guile chooses his family. He walks away from the hatred that has driven him for years and returns home to the people who matter most. In a lesser story, Guile becomes a killer. In Street Fighter 2, he becomes a better man. It's a surprisingly wholesome ending that gives Guile one of the strongest character arcs in the entire game. Next up is Chun-Li, the first and only female fighter in the World Warrior roster. Hailing from China, Chun-Li enters the tournament for reasons very different from the other competitors. Her story revolves around finding the person responsible for her father's death. Believing the criminal organization Shadaloo to be involved, she has spent years tracking their activities and gathering information in hopes of finding the truth. Like many Street Fighter characters, Chun-Li's design pulled inspiration from multiple sources. Her original outfit and overall appearance were influenced by Tong Ku from Capcom Strider. Designer Akira Yasuda also drew inspiration from Tao from the anime film Armageddon Gemma Wars. Finally, her famous kicking techniques were inspired by martial artist actress Angela Mao, whose speed and athleticism became a major influence on Chun-Li's fighting style. After defeating Bison, Chun-Li's journey finally reaches its conclusion. She visits her father's grave and informs him that his death has been avenged. It's a quiet ending, especially compared to some of the others, but that's what makes it effective. Chun-Li isn't celebrating victory or chasing another challenge. She's finding closure. For years, she was driven by loss and the need for answers. Now that she's accomplished her goal, she can finally move forward with her life. It's a simple ending, but it perfectly captures who Chun-Li is, a determined fighter who never stops searching for justice. Now we get to Zangief, another wrestling archetype on the roster. Based on his biography, Zangief initially comes across as a fairly straightforward character. He's a massive Soviet wrestler who enjoys testing his strength against anyone willing to step into the ring with him. In fact, according to his lore, he's known for wrestling bears for fun, which should tell you everything you need to know about and how intimidating this man is supposed to be. His inspiration comes from Viktor Zangief, a highly decorated Soviet freestyle wrestler who competed in both New Japan Pro Wrestling and the UWFI. Capcom used him as a cultural visual foundation for the character. Throughout the tournament, Zangief's personality is exactly what you expect. He loves fighting, loves showing off his strength, and isn't afraid to drive an opponent headfirst to the ground with one of his signature wrestling moves. After defeating M. Bison, Zangief's ending reveals that his motivation was never really about personal glory. Instead, the president of the Soviet Union appears to congratulate him for bringing honor and recognition to his country. The two then proceed to celebrate together in one of the more memorable and bizarre endings in the entire game. Overall, Zangief isn't the deepest character on the roster, but I don't think he's trying to be one either. He's the embodiment of strength, national pride, and professional wrestling all rolled into one giant mountain of muscle. Now we travel to India and take a look at Dasim. Unlike most of the roster, Dasim isn't driven by revenge, pride, competition, or even the desire to prove himself. Instead, he's just a yoga master who spent years unifying his mind, body, and soul through meditation and spiritual discipline. His fighting style reflects his philosophy perfectly. Rather than rushing down his opponents, Dasim prefers keeping his distance, patiently waiting for an opening before striking. Of course, he's also capable of stretching his arms and legs to impossible lengths, making him one of the strangest fighters in the entire game. As for his inspiration, Dasim's appearance and fighting style are often linked to the Indian fighter from the 1976 film, Master of the Flying Guillotine. Early concepts for the character were even more ambitious, with developers originally considering giving him 6 arms and the appearance of the Hindu deity Ganesha. While those ideas were eventually removed, traces of that inspiration remain, including an imagery of Ganesha appearing in the background of the stage. After defeating Bison, Dasim returns home to his family. Years later, his young son notices a picture hanging on the wall and asks him about it. Dasim simply explains it represents a previous chapter in his life. What I like about this ending is how peaceful it is. Unlike Ryu, who immediately goes back to training, or Guile and Chun-Li, who are driven by personal loss, Dasim doesn't seem interested in trophies, fame, or recognition. The tournament was simply another step on his spiritual journey. His story isn't about becoming stronger than anyone else. It's about proving to himself that the years of discipline, meditation, and self-control were worthwhile. For a roster filled with loud personalities and larger-than-life fighters, Dasim serves as a calm and thoughtful contrast to everyone around him. Now understand, in other iterations of Street Fighter, The 4 bosses have bios and their own endings, so I'll get into those characters in those sections. But before we move on, there's one thing I need to talk about Street Fighter 2 that tends to confuse newcomers, especially if you're looking at different versions of the game from around the world. And that's the boss names. If you ever wonder why people sometimes call M. Bison Vega or Balrog M. Bison, you're not losing your mind. Originally, the boxer we know as Balrog was actually named M. Bison in Japan. If you look at him, the reason becomes pretty obvious. He was heavily inspired by Mike Tyson, so his original name was essentially Mike Bison. The problem was that Capcom was preparing to release the game overseas and became concerned that the similarities between the characters, Mike Tyson and M. Bison, might lead to a lawsuit. So rather than risk it, they changed the names. The boxer known as M. Bison became Balrog. The claw-wielding Spanish fighter originally known as Balrog became Vega, and the final boss originally known as Vega became M. Bison. Yes, Capcom basically rotated the names around in a circle. So if you're playing the Japanese version of Street Fighter 2, the names are different from what most North American and European players grew up with. It's one of the strangest localization decisions in gaming history, and all of it happened because Capcom wanted to avoid the possibility of a single lawsuit. I know it's confusing, but don't worry. For the rest of the retrospective, I'll be using the North American names, since those are the ones we are mainly familiar with. As successful as Street Fighter 2 was in the arcades, Capcom knew that not everyone had an arcade cabinet sitting in the living rooms, so naturally the next step was bringing the World Warrior home. Over the years, Street Fighter 2 would find its way into a surprisingly number of different platforms. Some versions came remarkably close to the arcade experience, while others had to make major sacrifices due to hardware limitations. For many players, the definitive home version of the World Warrior was the Super Nintendo release. Even today, it remains one of the best-selling games on the platform. While it wasn't arcade perfect, it retained the full roster, most of the visual presentation, and a 6-button control scheme that made Street Fighter 2 so popular in the first place. For a lot of people, this wasn't just their first Street Fighter, it was their first fighting game. Now, beyond the SNES, the game also found its way to a variety of home computers, including the MS-DOS, the Amiga, the Atari ST, the Commodore 64, and the ZX Spectrum. Unfortunately, many of these versions struggled to create the arcade experience. Graphics were reduced, animations were cut back, the music was often missing or altered, and perhaps most importantly, many of these systems lack proper 6-button controls. As a result, these ports are genuinely viewed as heavily compromised versions of the game. If you wanted the closest thing to owning the arcade version at home, Capcom also released Street Fighter 2 for the CPS changer. Since the CPS changer was essentially a arcade hardware designed for home use, it provided one of the most authentic ways to experience the World Warrior without actually owning an arcade cabinet. Then perhaps there was the most ambitious port of them all, the Game Boy version. Released in 1995, this version somehow managed to squeeze Street Fighter 2 onto Nintendo's monochrome handheld. Naturally, some sacrifices had to be made. Dacem, E Honda, and Vega were removed from the roster. Graphics were simplified, stage interactions were reduced, and the 6-button control scheme had to be redesigned around Game Boy's 2-button layout. Despite these limitations, it's honestly impressive that Street Fighter 2 was even running on the hardware at all. There was even a standalone Tiger Electronics version for those brave enough to experience Street Fighter 2 in one of the most simplified forms. Looking across all of these releases, the biggest differences usually came down to 4 areas: controls, graphics, sound, and content. The further you moved away from arcade hardware, the more compromises developers had to make. Overall, if you're looking for the closest arcade experience, the CPS changer version is the clear winner. If you're looking for the most important home release, it's hard to argue against the Super Nintendo version. And if you're curious about just how much developers could squeeze out of a weaker hardware, the Game Boy and various computer ports are fascinating examples of making the impossible possible. So when we look at how Street Fighter II: The World Warrior was when it first launched in arcades, its success wasn't immediately everywhere. In Japan, many players initially approached it as a single-player game rather than a competitive experience that Capcom had intended for it to be. According to Yoshiki Okamoto, some of the people within Capcom even questioned whether the company would have been better off creating another beat-em-up like Final Fight. That quickly changed. Once players began discovering the game's head-to-head multiplayer, arcades transformed into battlegrounds. Instead of simply trying to beat the computer, players were challenging each other to beat each other. They were putting quarters into the cabinets and competing to see who was the best fighter in the room. The game exploded in popularity. Street Fighter II became the highest grossing arcade game in Japan during 1991 and continued dominating arcades through 92 and 93. The success wasn't limited to Japan either. In North America, the game exceeded Capcom's expectations almost immediately, with arcade operators reporting earnings far beyond what most games at the time could generate. The impact was so large that many industry publications credited Street Fighter II with helping revitalize the arcade business. At a time when some believed arcades were beginning to lose relevance, Street Fighter II proved that there was still a massive audience willing to gather around a machine and compete. By the mid-90s, Street Fighter II had been played by an estimated 25 million people in the United States alone, across both arcades and home releases. Capcom would eventually sell tens of thousands of arcade cabinets worldwide, while the Super Nintendo version became one of the best-selling games on the entire platform. Critics were equally impressed. Reviewers praised the game's roster, presentation, controls, animation, and competitive depth. Many critics considered it one of the greatest arcade games ever made, while the Super Nintendo version was frequently described as one of the finest home conversions of an arcade title ever released. Looking back today, it's easy to understand why Street Fighter II didn't simply improve upon the original game. It redefined what a fighting game could be. The roster was larger, the controls were smoother, the presentation was stronger, the competitive scene was unlike anything most players had ever experienced before, and perhaps most importantly, people couldn't stop playing it. There was just one problem. The more people played Street Fighter II, the better they became at it. Players began mastering characters, discovering strategies, finding ways to dominate the competition. Soon, fans started asking for something new. More characters, more balance changes, more reasons to keep feeding quarters into the machine. Capcom was more than happy to provide that. Which brings us to the next iteration of Street Fighter II. By March of 1992, Street Fighter had become a worldwide phenomenon. Arcades were packed with players, competition was becoming more intense, and people had spent an entire year mastering the original World Warrior roster. There was only one problem. Players wanted more. To answer the demands, Capcom released Street Fighter II Champion Edition. Rather than creating an entirely new game, Champion Edition was designed to expand upon the foundation established by the World Warrior while addressing many of the requests players had been making since launch. The biggest change was undoubtedly the addition of the 4 Grandmasters as playable characters. For the first time, players could finally control Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and M. Bison instead of only facing them at the end of the game. Now, to be fair, Capcom did tone these characters down somewhat from their World Warrior versions. If you've played the original arcade release, you know the bosses could feel absolutely ridiculous at times. While they remain powerful in Champion Edition, they were no longer the nearly impossible monsters players had encountered in the original game. Another major addition was the introduction of mirror matches. This may not sound like a huge deal today, but prior to Champion Edition, players couldn't select the same exact character as their opponent. If one player picked Ryu, then Ryu was off the table for everyone else. Champion Edition changed that. Now players could finally settle debates once and for all. If two friends both claimed to be better Ryu players, they could simply pick the same character and let the results speak for themselves. To help distinguish the fighters, Capcom introduced alternate color palettes. One player could use the traditional colors while the other would receive an alternate costume. This simple change would eventually become a staple of the entire fighting game genre. Capcom also revisited the balance of the original roster. Various attacks were adjusted, and for the first time, Ryu and Ken began developing distinct identities instead of feeling like near identical clones. While they still shared many techniques, Champion Edition started pushing them down separate paths that future games will continue to expand upon. Outside of gameplay, several visual improvements were made as well. Character portraits were updated, stage color palettes were adjusted, certain endings received revisions, and new music was added to the staff role sequence. Looking back, Champion Edition wasn't trying to reinvent Street Fighter 2, it was trying to perfect it. The World Warrior created the phenomenon, and Champion Edition was going to refine it. This game also makes a few adjustments to the bonus stages. In the World Warrior, you could encounter the car stage later in the game, but here Capcom rearranged the order. The car bonus stage now appears first, followed by the brick breaking challenge. The biggest addition, however, was the barrel breaker challenge. In this challenge, you stand beneath a conveyor belt as barrels continuously drop from above. The objective overall is simple: destroy every barrel before it can roll away. While the game appears to place you under a strict time limit, the counter is actually tracking how many barrels remain rather than how much time is left. Each barrel destroyed awards points, encouraging players to break them as quickly as efficiently as possible. If you're skilled enough to destroy every barrel and earn a perfect bonus on top of it, the score payout becomes massive. Now, like I said during my World Warrior section, I wanted to save the 4 boss characters for Champion Edition since this is the first time players were actually allowed to use them. Up until this point, Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and Bison were simply obstacles standing between you and victory. Now, they're fully playable fighters with their own bios and endings. So, let's start with Balrog. Now, we all know who this guy is inspired by, and it's the entire reason Capcom had to change his name outside of Japan in the first place. According to his bio, Balrog is a former heavyweight boxing champion who was efficiently kicked out of professional boxing due to his violent behavior and inability to follow the rules. Rather than cleaning up his act, Balrog embraced his aggression, eventually catching the attention of Bison, who recruited him to the Shadalo. Honestly, Balrog is exactly what you expect from a character inspired by Mike Tyson. He hits hard, fights dirty, and solves most of his problems with fists. His ending is surprisingly hilarious. After winning the tournament, Balrog delivers a speech about the American dream and acts as though he's some kind of inspirational role model. Considering everything we know about him, it comes across as completely ridiculous, which is exactly why it works. Next up is Vega, otherwise known as Street Fighter's resident narcissist. Born into Spanish nobility, Vega combines the art of ninjutsu with the techniques of a matador, creating one of the most unique fighting styles in the entire roster. His speed, agility, and signature claw make him unlike anything else in the game. Vega lives by a very simple philosophy: beauty is strength. He views himself as physically perfect and despises anything he considers ugly. In fact, he wears his famous mask not to hide his face, but to protect it from being scarred in battle. As one of Bison's top assassins, Vega often handles Shadowlu's dirty work personally, dispatching opponents with ruthless efficiency. His design draws inspiration from several sources, including the legendary hero Zorro and the Phantom of the Opera, particularly the idea of a masked individual obsessed with beauty and perfection. His ending perfectly summarizes his worldview with the infamous line, "The ugly deserve no mercy." And honestly, that tells you everything you need to know about Vega as a character. Now we come to a familiar face. The final boss in the original Street Fighter is finally playable. According to his bio, Sagat was once known as the King of Street Fighters, a title he proudly used until suffering a devastating defeat at the hands of Ryu. Not only did he lose the match, but he was permanently scarred by Ryu's Shoryuken. Ever since that moment, Sagat has been obsessed with reclaiming his title. Despite his association with the Shadaloo, Sagat is actually one of the more honorable characters on the roster. Unlike Bison or Vega, he isn't motivated by power or cruelty. He's motivated by pride and a desire to prove that he is still the strongest fighter in the world. His ending reflects it perfectly. Rather than celebrating his victory, Sagat immediately begins looking towards the future. He waits patiently for the day he can face Ryu once again, viewing the scar on his chest not as a mark of failure, but as a reminder of the challenge he still has left to overcome. It's a simple ending, but one that perfectly sets up one of Street Fighter's greatest rivalries. And now we arrive at the man behind everything, M. Bison. According to his bio, no one truly knows where Bison came from. What people do know is that he commands the criminal organization Shadulo and possesses power far beyond that of a normal human being. Bison rules through fear, manipulation, and overwhelming strength, while he often allows his subordinates to carry out his orders. He is more than capable of handling matters personally whenever necessary. Through his mastery of psycho power, Bison has established himself as the most dangerous fighter in the tournament. The character draws inspiration from numerous villains, including Katao from Tieto Monogatari, whose supernatural powers and military appearance heavily influenced Bison's design. Elements of his personality and physical appearance were also inspired by villains from manga and martial arts fiction, helping create one of gaming's most recognizable antagonists. His ending is exactly what you expect from the self-proclaimed King of Destruction. After winning the tournament, Bison switches as Shadaloo expands its influence across the globe. Nations fall under his control, opposition is crushed, and his dream of world domination becomes his reality. As the ending concludes, Bison proudly acknowledges a player's role in his success with the line, "Thanks to you, the world is mine." And honestly, for a villain like M. Bison, there couldn't be a more fitting ending. With the bosses now playable and the roster now expanded to 12 fighters, Champion Edition felt like the complete version of Street Fighter 2, but Capcom wasn't done updating the game just yet. Unlike the World Warrior, which seemed determined to appear on every piece of hardware imaginable, Champion Edition had a much more focused approach when it came to home releases. Since this version was built around refining the competitive experience rather than reinventing the game, many of the ports were judged almost entirely by one question: how close are they to the arcade version? One of the earliest home releases arrived on the PC Engine in Japan. For many fans, this became one of the strongest home conversions available at the time. Not only did it include the playable bosses and mirror matches that defined Champion Edition, but it also retained the barrel-breaking bonus stage that many home versions had previously omitted. While the audio naturally sounded better due to the hardware sound chip, the gameplay itself remained remarkably faithful to the arcade release. Sega fans would eventually receive Street Fighter II Special Championship Edition on the Genesis and the Mega Drive. This version is particularly important because it finally brought Street Fighter II to Sega hardware after Nintendo had dominated the home market with the World Warrior. Capcom even worked alongside Sega to create a dedicated 6-button controller specifically for the game, helping preserve the feel of the arcade controls. Interestingly, development was delayed so Capcom could improve on additional features that had appeared in later arcade revisions, making this version more than just a straightforward Champion Edition port. If you were looking for the closest possible arcade experience at home, however, the X68000 version was the clear winner. Released exclusively in Japan, this port is often regarded as one of the most accurate home conversions of Champion Edition ever produced. The graphics were nearly identical to the arcade release. The gameplay felt virtually unchanged, and under the right hardware setup, even the sound quality came remarkably close to the original cabinet. Of course, Champion Edition would eventually find its way to numerous complications over the years. Looking back, the biggest differences between Champion Edition ports usually came down to three things: controls, audio, and arcade accuracy. The core gameplay remained largely intact across most releases, but some versions came much closer to recreating the arcade experience than others. Overall, if you're looking for the most authentic version outside the arcade itself, the X68000 release is often considered the gold standard. If you're looking for the most influential home release, that honor probably belongs to the Genesis version, which finally brought Street Fighter II to Sega fans around the world. Now, if Capcom was worried that Champion Edition would simply be viewed as an expansion pack to the World Warrior, those concerns quickly disappeared. Champion Edition was an enormous success. In Japan alone, over 140,000 arcade units were sold, generating billions of yen in revenue and making it one of the most successful arcade releases of the era. The game quickly climbed the arcade charts through 1992 and became one of the highest grossing arcade titles in the country. The same story played out overseas. When Champion Edition arrived in North America, arcade operators immediately began placing large orders for the game. Throughout much of '92, it sat at the top of the arcade earnings charts, proving that players weren't finished with Street Fighter II just because they had already mastered the World Warrior. The game also found success in Europe and Australia, where arcades were reporting large crowds gathering around cabinets. By this point, Street Fighter II wasn't simply popular, it had become a cultural phenomenon. Financially, Champion Edition was one of the most successful arcade games ever made. Its worldwide arcade earnings would eventually exceed $2 billion, placing it alongside some of the biggest arcade legends in gaming history. Critics, they were equally as impressed. The game received numerous awards and was named Best Game of 1992 by Gamers Magazine in Japan, while reviewers praised Capcom's decision to make the boss characters playable and continue refining the competitive balance of the game. Even the home versions found success. So, Street Fighter Championship Edition on the Sega Genesis would eventually sell over 1.6 billion copies worldwide and receive strong reviews from critics, many of whom considered it one of the best fighting games available on the platform. Looking back, Champion Edition accomplished exactly what Capcom needed it to accomplish. It gave players more characters, it improved the balance, it expanded the competitive scene, and most importantly, it proved that Street Fighter 2 wasn't a one-hit wonder. The franchise has staying power. But while Champion Edition successfully expanded the roster and refined the formula, Capcom soon found itself facing a new problem. Once again, the players were getting too good, and some arcade operators had already begun modifying their machines to make the game faster so people could pay more. And once again, Capcom would take notice, which brings us to the next iteration of Street Fighter 2. On December 17, 1992, Capcom released Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting, known in Japan as Street Fighter II Turbo. What's fascinating about this version is that it only exists because players essentially hacked the previous game. Following the success of Champion Edition, arcade operators and bootleggers began creating modified versions of the game. The most famous of these was the Rainbow Edition, an unofficial hack that dramatically increased the game speed while introducing all sorts of crazy changes. Fireballs could travel in strange directions, characters could perform attacks they normally shouldn't be able to, and matches moved at an absurd pace compared to Champion Edition. Normally, a company would try to shut something like that down. Capcom did something smarter. They paid attention. The company realized that players genuinely enjoyed the faster gameplay and more aggressive pace. Rather than allowing bootleg versions to define the future of Street Fighter II, Capcom decided to create an official version that embraced some of those ideas while maintaining proper balance. The result was hyper fighting. The most noticeable change is right there in the title. The game is faster, much faster. Characters move quicker, attacks come out faster, and matches feel far more aggressive than they did in the Champion Edition. Suddenly, players had less time to react and needed to be more precise with their inputs. What worked in Champion Edition wouldn't always work here because the speed of that game demanded faster decision making. And honestly, after playing Champion Edition and then jumping into hyper fighting, the difference is immediately noticeable. The game simply feels more intense. Capcom also expanded the moveset of much of the roster. While no new fighters were added, many of the existing characters gained new techniques. Ryu and Ken could now perform their hurricane kicks while airborne. E Honda received the super body slam, giving him another option against aerial opponents. Blanca gained a vertical rolling attack in addition to his additional horizontal roll. Chun-Li received the Kyoken projectile and could now perform her spinning bird kick in the air. Zangief gained the turbo clothesline, further enhancing his wrestling arsenal, and Dasim was given perhaps one of the most interesting additions of all, the yoga teleport, allowing him to instantly reposition himself around the screen. These additions might seem minor by modern standards, but they helped make the roster feel more dynamic and gave players new strategies to experiment with. Capcom also updated many of the character color palettes. New default colors were introduced across the roster while previous color schemes became alternate selections. It's not a massive gameplay change, but it helps distinguish Hyper Fighting visually from earlier releases. Looking back, Hyper Fighting wasn't trying to reinvent Street Fighter 2. Champion Edition had already expanded the roster and refined the balance. Hyper Fighting was focused on one thing: speed. Capcom saw what players wanted and gave it to them. The result was one of the fastest, most beloved versions of Street Fighter 2 ever released. Now, unlike the World Warrior and Champion Edition, Hyper Fighting didn't receive a massive list of unique ports. Instead, most players experienced this version through one release in particular, the Super Nintendo version. Released in '93 as Street Fighter 2 Turbo, this version became the definitive home release for many fans. Built upon the original SNES version of Street Fighter 2, Capcom expanded the cartridge size and packed the content from both Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting. One of the biggest additions was the ability to choose between two styles of play. Players could experience Champion Edition through the game's normal mode, while Turbo mode allowed them to enjoy faster gameplay introduced in Hyper Fighting. Better yet, players could adjust the game's speed settings, allowing matches to become even faster in the arcade version if they wanted a true test of reflexes. Capcom also restored several pieces of content that had been absent from the original SNES release. The bell-breaking bonus stage returned, country announcements were restored, character endings were updated to more closely resemble the arcade version, and various sound effects were added to enhance the presentation. Overall, this version gave players a much more complete Street Fighter 2 experience than the original SNES release. As for Sega players, Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition had already included options that allowed players to enable many of Hyper Fighting's rules and speed settings. While it wasn't a dedicated Hyper Fighting port, it still provided Genesis owners with a taste of the faster gameplay Capcom had introduced. Looking back, Hyper Fighting's home releases weren't about giving players dozens of different versions to choose from. Instead, Capcom focused on delivering the most complete Street Fighter 2 package possible. And for many players in 1993, Street Fighter 2 Turbo on the SNES became the version they spent countless hours mastering in their living rooms. So, just like previous versions of Street Fighter 2, Hyper Fighting proved to be another massive success for Capcom. In Japanese arcades, Street Fighter 2 Turbo quickly climbed to the charts and became one of the most successful arcade games in the country. By the end of '93, it stood as the highest grossing arcade game in Japan, proving that players had fully embraced the faster pace and expanded moveset Capcom had introduced. The same success carried over into North America. Throughout much of 1993, Hyper Fighting consistently appeared near the top of arcade earnings charts, becoming one of the most profitable conversion kits available to arcade operators. Rather than replacing Street Fighter 2's popularity, Hyper Fighting extended it. Critics were equally enthusiastic. Reviewers praised the increased speed, improved balance, and additional moves that made matches feel more dynamic than ever before. Many consider Hyper Fighting the definitive version of Street Fighter 2 up to that point, taking everything players loved about Champion Edition and pushing it even further. The Super Nintendo version found similar success. It topped sales charts in Japan and would eventually sell more than 4 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling games on the platform. Review scores were consistently high across the board, with publications praising both the arcade accuracy and the amount of content included in the package. Looking back, Hyper Fighting accomplished exactly what it set out to do in the first place. Never trying to reinvent Street Fighter 2, never trying to introduce an entirely new cast. Instead, take the existing formula and make it faster, make it more intense, and make it more competitive. For many players, this was the version where Street Fighter 2 truly hit its stride. But by 1993, Capcom found itself facing another challenge. The roster had remained largely unchanged since Champion Edition. Players had mastered the original cast, mastered the bosses, and mastered the faster gameplay of Hyper Fighting. This time, simply making the game faster wouldn't be enough. Players wanted something new. New fighters, new stages, new music, new reasons to keep dropping quarters into the arcade cabinet. Capcom answered that demand the only way they knew how, by bringing in 4 new challengers, which leads us to the next iteration of Street Fighter 2. On September 14th, 1993, Capcom unveiled the next evolution of Street Fighter II, with Super Street Fighter II, the new challengers. Now, unlike Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting, which primarily focused on balancing the roster and refining gameplay, Super Street Fighter II had a much bigger goal in mind. It wanted to expand the world. For the first time since Street Fighter II launched in arcades, Capcom introduced entirely new fighters to the roster. Joining the tournament were Cammy from the UK, T-Hawk from Mexico, DJ from Jamaica, and Fei Long from Hong Kong. These 4 newcomers would increase the roster to 16 playable characters and bring new fighting styles, personalities, and storylines into the franchise. The world itself became larger, while returning locations from previous games remained. New stages and countries were added to reflect the expanded cast, making the World Warrior Tournament feel bigger than ever before. With 16 playable characters, Super Street Fighter II finally feels like a complete package. Back in World Warrior, having 8 characters was revolutionary. Champion Edition pushed that number to 12. Now Capcom had doubled the original roster and created one of the largest fighting game lineups available during the 16-bit era. Even better, the new fighters don't feel like filler additions. Each brings unique fighting styles and personalities to the roster, making the tournament feel more diverse than ever before. Behind the scenes, Super Street Fighter II was also significant because it marked the end of an era. Hyper Fighting had been the final Street Fighter II game built on Capcom's original CPS-1 arcade hardware. The new challengers moved the series to the more powerful CPS-2 hardware, allowing for improved visuals, enhanced audio, and a more polished presentation overall. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, Super Street Fighter II doesn't reinvent the wheel, unlike World Warrior did, but it does continue building upon everything Capcom had learned over the previous 3 versions. The first thing you notice is the presentation. Almost every stage received graphical updates, character portraits were redrawn, and the game opens up with an entirely new introduction featuring Ryu launching a Hadouken directly at the screen. The music and sound effects were also reworked, and Capcom even brought in a new announcer to give the game a fresh identity. It may not sound like much on paper, but when comparing Hyper Fighting to the new challengers side by side, you can immediately tell Capcom wanted this game to feel like a major upgrade. Another interesting addition is the scoring system. Visually, this is probably the biggest leap Street Fighter II had seen since the original release. Between the updated stages, redrawn portraits, new music, and brand new announcer, Super Street Fighter II feels less like another update and more like an actual sequel. If you put Hyper Fighting and the new challenger side by side, you can immediately tell Capcom wanted players to feel like they were playing something new. Previous games primarily rewarded players for winning matches and performing well in bonus stages. Super Street Fighter II goes a step further by tracking things such as first attacks, reversals, recoveries, and most importantly, combos. One thing I noticed while playing this is that combos felt easier to execute than some of the earlier Street Fighter II versions. You still needed timing and practice, but a simple 2 or 3 hit combinations are much more approachable here. It makes the game feel welcoming to new players while leaving plenty of room for advanced players to master the system. Now, to be clear, combos already existed in previous Street Fighter II games. We've already covered how that mechanic was accidentally discovered by Capcom and embraced by the community. The difference here is the game now actively recognizes them. Players are rewarded for stringing attacks together, which further encourages mastery of each character's moveset. Character customization also receives an upgrade. Rather than simply choosing between default and alternate palettes, players now have access to 8 different color schemes for every fighter. You can select the original World Warrior colors, their Capcom Champion Edition, and Hyper Fighting colors, or experiment with several entirely new combinations. It doesn't affect gameplay, but it does help make mirror matches feel a little bit more unique. One change that surprised me was the game speed. Now, after Hyper Fighting dramatically increased the pace of combat, Super Street Fighter II actually slows things back down. The speed is much closer to Champion Edition than Hyper Fighting, giving matches a more methodical feel. Depending on who you ask, this is either a positive or a negative. Some players prefer the lightning fast pace of Hyper Fighting, while others appreciated having a little more time to react and think during a match. Personally, I think this was a smart decision. Hyperfighting was incredibly fun, but matches could become chaotic in a hurry. Super Street Fighter 2 finds the middle ground between original World Warrior and hyperfighting. It still feels fast, but you have enough time to react, you have enough time to think, you have enough time to execute a strategy instead of simply trying to keep up with the CPU. The most unique feature, however, was something most players never experienced. Another thing I appreciate is how balanced the roster feels overall. Sure, some characters are stronger than others, but I never felt forced into choosing a specific fighter just to compete. Nearly every character feels viable if you're willing to spend time learning their strengths and weaknesses, which wasn't always true in earlier fighting games. Capcom released a special arcade version called Tournament Battle. This mode linked together 4 arcade cabinets and allowed up to 8 players to compete in a single elimination tournament. Winners would advance through the bracket while losers would be eliminated until only one champion remained standing. Looking back, Tournament Battle almost feels like Capcom accidentally predicted the future. Long before EVO, live streams, and modern esports, Capcom had already created this version of Street Fighter 2 designed around organized competition. In many ways, this mode offered a glimpse into what the fighting game community would eventually become. Another addition I found interesting was the group battle mode. While most people think of Street Fighter as a simple one-on-one fighting game, Super Street Fighter 2 gave players the ability to create small teams of fighters and compete across a series of matches. The first option was match play. Here, both players selected the same number of characters, anywhere from 1 to about 8. The first fighter from each would battle, followed by the second fighter, then the third, and so on and so forth until every match had been completed. The second option was elimination. This mode was much closer to what modern fighting game fans would recognize as team battle. Players could choose up to 8 fighters once again, and whenever a character won a match, they stayed in the tournament until they were defeated. The first player to lose their entire roster eventually lost the competition. Looking back, this was another example of Capcom experimenting with ways to make Street Fighter more social and competitive. Between group battle and tournament battle, you can already see the company laying the groundwork for the kinds of organized competitions and team formulas that will become popular in modern days. Super Street Fighter 2 also introduced Time Challenge mode. This mode strips Street Fighter down to its most basic objective: win as fast as possible. After selecting your fighter, you choose an opponent for the CPU to control, and then attempt to score a knockout in the shortest time imaginable. Unlike the standard arcade mode, you only have a single round to get the job done, meaning every second counts. What I like about this mode is that it creates a completely different way to approach the game. Instead of focusing on survival or winning a tournament, players are encouraged to find the most efficient strategies possible. Every combo, every special move, and every opening becomes an opportunity to shave precious seconds off their time. If players managed to beat Capcom's record times, then they were rewarded with the ability to enter their initials into the leaderboard, immortalizing themselves as one of the fastest fighters around. It's relatively a small addition, but much like group battle and tournament battle, it shows Capcom looking for new ways to keep players engaged beyond simply clearing the arcade mode again and again. Now it's time to get into the 4 new challengers, starting with Cammy from the United Kingdom. Let's be honest, if you've never played Street Fighter before, you've probably seen Cammy. Whether it's fan art, whether it's cosplay, or just gaming culture in general, she has become one of the most recognizable characters in the entire franchise. According to her bio, Cammy is an operative working for British intelligence. Before joining the organization, however, she was discovered near a military installation, suffering from complete memory loss with no recollection of who she was or where she came from. She was taken in, trained by special forces, and eventually became one of their top agents. Her mission in the World Warrior Tournament is simple: uncover the truth about her mysterious past. Her design was inspired by Misty from the manga Wounded Men, particularly the idea of a blonde, emotionless assassin. Her forearm gauntlets were also inspired by the science fiction manga Appleseed. After defeating Bison, Cammy finally confronts the man who seems connected to her forgotten history. Bison claims that her memory loss was caused by an accident and even goes as far as saying the two were once lovers. Thankfully, Delta Red isn't buying any of it, and they convince Cammy to leave with them. While she doesn't get all the answers she's looking for, she finally takes the first step in towards uncovering who she truly is. Next up, we have Fei Long from Hong Kong. And if you've played enough fighting games, you know every fighting game franchise eventually gets a Bruce Lee inspired character. Mortal Kombat has Liu Kang, Tekken has Martial Law, and Street Fighter has Fei Long. According to his bio, Fei Long became obsessed with martial arts after watching kung fu films as a child. While he originally dreamed of becoming a movie star, he eventually abandoned that goal in favor of pursuing honor, discipline, and self-improvement through martial arts. The tournament serves as a way for him to test his skills against the strongest fighters in the world. As you probably guessed, his inspiration directly comes from Bruce Lee. From his appearance, mannerisms, fighting stance, and battle cries, Fei Long is essentially Street Fighter's love letter to one of the most influential martial artists in entertainment history. Ironically, after defeating M. Bison, a movie director approaches him and offers him the opportunity to become a star. Fei Long declines the offer, deciding that perfecting his craft is more important than fame. It's a fitting end for a character whose entire story revolves around discipline over celebrity. Now we're heading over to Jamaica for DJ. Out of all the new characters added in Super Street Fighter 2, DJ is probably the most upbeat and energetic of the bunch. According to his bio, DJ is both a kickboxer and a musician. Over the years, he has blended his love of music into his fighting style, creating a rhythm-based approach to combat unlike anyone else in the fighting tournament. In his mind, winning the tournament will help him reach the top of the music charts as well. His design was inspired by martial arts actor and future Tay-Bo creator Billy Blanks, particularly his role in The King of the Kickboxers. Interestingly enough, DJ is also the only character from this era of Street Fighter that was primarily designed by Capcom USA rather than the Japanese development team. Even his name is a play on the term DJ or disc jockey. After defeating Bison, DJ finally finds the inspiration he had been searching for. The experience gives him the idea for a brand new song, which launches him into superstardom. While most Street Fighter characters are chasing revenge, redemption, or glory, DJ just wanted a hit record. Honestly, it's kind of refreshing. Finally, we arrive in Mexico to meet T-Hawk, who's also known as Thunderhawk. Standing at a towering 7 feet inches tall, T-Hawk immediately establishes himself as one of the most physically imposing fighters in the entire roster. When you look at his bio, you learn that T-Hawk's homeland was stolen by Shadow Law, forcing his people to relocate to Mexico. Ever since then, he has dedicated his life to reclaiming what was taken from his tribe and bringing M. Bison to justice. Entering the World Warrior tournament gives him the opportunity to finally confront the man responsible. The character was originally conceived as a Geronimo archetype before Capcom changed the concept. His final design draws inspiration from various Native American and indigenous Mexican cultures, while his moveset incorporates birds of prey imagery through attacks such as the Condor Drive and the Tomahawk Buster. Rather than focusing on traditional martial arts, T-Hawk fights through sheer power, reach, and surprisingly quick mobility for a man of his size. After defeating Bison, T-Hawk finally demands answers for why his people were driven from their homeland. Bison's response is as cold as you expect, because he could. After dealing with the dictator, T-Hawk returns home and vows to rebuild what was lost. Unlike many of the other fighters, T-Hawk isn't fighting for fame, glory, or personal growth. He's fighting for his people, and that gives his story a little more weight than some of the others on the roster. Now, when it comes to playing the new challengers at home, Capcom made sure players had plenty of options. The most common way to experience the game was, of course, on the Super Nintendo. This marked the third Street Fighter II release on the system following World Warrior and Turbo. What makes this version stand out is the amount of content packed into the cartridge. In addition to the arcade mode and versus mode, players could access group battle, time challenge, and even the tournament mode from the arcade version. Multiple speed settings were also available, allowing players to customize the pace of the matches to their liking. If you grew up with a Super Nintendo, there's a good chance this might have been your introduction to the new challengers and or Street Fighter as a whole. The Sega Genesis version released around the same time and was almost identical to the Super Nintendo counterpart. The biggest difference was in the presentation. The Genesis version featured additional announcer voice clips, including the announcer calling out character names after matches. It also included an expert setting that expanded the roster of opponents faced in a single player mode from 12 fighters to all 16 characters. For Sega fans, this was one of the console's premier fighting games. For those living in Japan and owning a Sharp X68000, Capcom delivered one of the most arcade-accurate versions of the game available at that time. The visuals were almost identical to the arcade release, with only a handful of small differences. Even the sound quality remained impressively close to the original hardware. If accuracy was the goal, this was one of the best home versions available at that time. Japan also received a release on the Fujimitsu FM Towns. While not as well known today, this version remained faithful to the arcade game and even included an arranged soundtrack as alternative to the original music. One unique feature allowed players to customize character color palettes, giving fighters an entirely new look before stepping into battle. Overall, players experienced the new challengers through the Super Nintendo or the Genesis, while enthusiasts searching for arcade perfection often gravitated toward the Japanese computer systems. No matter which platform you chose, however, one thing was clear: Street Fighter II had become too big to stay in an arcade. Now, just like every version before it, Super Street Fighter II was a massive success. In Japan, it quickly became one of the most popular arcade games in the country, topping arcade charts shortly after release and continuing Street Fighter II's dominance in the fighting game market. Capcom was so confident in the game's success that they projected the sales of 100,000 arcade units worldwide, an incredible number for any arcade title. The success continued at home as well. In Japan, the Super Famicom version sold nearly 1 million copies during 1994 alone, while in North America, both the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis versions toppled sales charts throughout the summer. By the end of its run, more than 2 million copies had been sold worldwide, proving that Street Fighter wasn't just an arcade phenomenon anymore. It had become one of the biggest gaming franchises on the planet. Critics were also largely positive. Many reviewers praised the expanded roster, improved presentation, and additional game modes. Cammy in particular became an instant fan favorite, with gaming magazines frequently ranking her amongst the most memorable new characters introduced that year. However, something interesting started happening around this time. For the first time, some critics began questioning Capcom's strategy. While most reviewers agreed that Super Street Fighter II was the best version of Street Fighter II released so far, some wondered why Capcom kept releasing updated versions of the same game rather than moving on to a true Street Fighter III. The improvements were appreciated, but after World Warrior, Champion Edition, Hyper Fighting, and now Super Street Fighter II, some players were beginning to experience a bit of sequel fatigue. Of course, Capcom wasn't finished yet, because while Super Street Fighter II expanded the roster and introduced 4 new challengers, one major thing was missing: speed. Some players missed the frantic pace of hyper fighting, and Capcom was listening. Which brings us to what many fans may consider the definitive way to play the 16-bit version of Street Fighter II. This brings us to the next version of Street Fighter II. date was February 23rd, 1994. And spoiler alert, everyone, Capcom did it again. Just 5 months after releasing Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers, Capcom returned to arcades with yet another update. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, known in Japan as Super Street Fighter 2 X Grandmaster Challenge. Now, at this point, you may be wondering how many versions of Street Fighter 2 can one company possibly make? Apparently, the answer was one more. Much like the Champion Edition and Hyper Fighting before it, Super Turbo was designed to refine what came before it. The new challenges had expanded the roster and improved the presentation, but many players missed the lightning fast pace of Hyper Fighting. Capcom instead listened to those complaints and brought back the speed. But the speed wasn't the only thing added. Super Turbo introduced one of the most important mechanics in franchise history, the Super Combo. For the first time, players could build a special meter during a battle and unleash a devastating attack capable of turning the tide of an entire match. Looking back, this single addition would influence not only future Street Fighter games, but fighting games as a whole. This game also introduced a hidden character named Akuma. At the time, he was little more than a secret boss hidden behind special sets of conditions. However, Akuma would go on to become one of the most iconic characters in the entire Street Fighter franchise and a recurring presence throughout Capcom's fighting game history. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo feels less like a new game and more like Capcom taking everything they had learned from the previous 4 entries and putting it into one package. For starters, the game is faster again. One of the biggest criticisms of the new challengers was that the gameplay speed had been slowed down compared to Hyper Fighting. Capcom heard those complaints and decided to bring the speed back. In fact, Super Turbo became the first Street Fighter arcade game to feature adjustable speed settings. Depending on how the arcade operator configured the machine, players could choose between multiple speed options before beginning the match. This allowed players to experience the game at a pace they were comfortable with. Visually, the game also received another facelift. The HUD was redesigned, new animation frames were added to characters, and several attacks were given updated visuals. Even the opening sequence was changed once again, now teasing the appearance of a mysterious new fighter who many players wouldn't discover until much later. But the biggest addition was by far the introduction of the Super Combo system. For the first time in Street Fighter history, players now had a super meter. As you landed attacks, blocked attacks, and participated in the fight, this meter would slowly fill. Once it reached maximum capacity, you can unleash a super combo and a devastating attack that dealt massive damage that could completely shift the momentum. Looking back, this is one of the most important additions in fighting game history. The idea of building a meter and spending it on powerful attacks became a staple not only for future Street Fighter games, but for the future of fighting games as a whole. The game also introduced air combos while allowing certain attacks to connect while both fighters were airborne. While they weren't nearly as extensive as to what players would later see in games like Marvel vs. Capcom, they added another layer of depth to high-level play. Beyond that, Capcom continued refining the roster. Characters received balance adjustments, new animation frames, and gameplay tweaks that helped make the cast feel more polished than ever before. By this point, Street Fighter 2 had evolved far beyond the game released in 1991. What started as an arcade fighter with 8 playable characters had become a highly competitive experience built around matchups, meter management, combos, and player skill. And then there was Akuma. Now, to be honest, I couldn't find a proper bio for Akuma anywhere in the manuals. I checked, I even looked through the old 3DO manual, and all Capcom really gave players was his name. No backstory, no explanation, no nothing, no special moves. It's a secret, and that honestly makes sense. He wasn't meant to be a normal character. He was always meant to be a secret. And his creation actually traces back to one of the most famous gaming hoaxes of all time. Back in '92, Electronic Gaming Monthly published an April Fool's joke claiming players could fight a secret character named Shang Long, the master for Ryu and Ken as seen in their bios. The rumors spread like wildfire, and players spent months trying to uncover the character that didn't exist. Capcom noticed, and rather than ignore the rumor, they decided to create something even better. The result was Akuma, known in Japan as Goki. Originally envisioned as a dark reflection of Ryu, Akuma embodies the Satsui no Hado, a dark power fueled by murderous intent. Visually, his design draws inspiration from the Neo, a wrathful guardian deities found in Buddhism. His prayer beads, wild hair, and intimidating physique, and the giant kanji on his back help give him an almost supernatural presence. The first time players encountered Akuma was unlike anything Street Fighter had ever done before. If certain conditions were met, Akuma would suddenly appear before the final battle. He would walk into the screen, destroy Bison with ease, and then challenge the player himself. After spending an entire game building up to Bison, suddenly a stronger fighter appeared out of nowhere and stole the spotlight. It was one of the coolest moments arcade players had ever seen. Of course, Capcom eventually hit a code that allowed players to use Akuma themselves. By entering a secret sequence, the character select screen, players could unlock him and experience one of the most overpowered fighters in Street Fighter history. And when I say overpowered, I mean overpowered. Akuma has devastating attacks, fireballs, a teleport, incredible mobility, and damage output that made him an immediate problem for competitive play. Many tournaments would eventually ban him outright because of how strong he was. What started as a response to a fake character named Shang Long ended with Capcom creating one of the most iconic characters in fighting game history. Moving along, when it comes to the ports to playing Street Fighter 2 Turbo, this is probably one of the strangest entries in the timeline. The game received a lot of ports over the years, but many of them were released on hardware that most people simply never owned. While Super Turbo is one of the most beloved versions of the game, it wasn't necessarily the easiest version to play at home. The first major home release arrived on a Panasonic 3DO. Now, if you're sitting there wondering what a 3DO is, you're probably not alone. The console was incredibly expensive, struggled to find an audience, and sold only a fraction of what systems like the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis managed. Despite that, Capcom delivered a surprisingly strong version of Super Turbo. The visuals were closer to the arcade than previous home releases, and it even retained features that had been missing from earlier console parts. After that came the versions for the DOS and the Amiga. These versions attempted to bring the arcade experience to home computers, but they came with their own issues. The DOS version suffered from various bugs and glitches at launch, while the Amiga version looked impressive but could struggle with performance unless you had upgraded hardware. They were respectable efforts, but definitely not the definitive way to experience the game. Then we arrive at what many fans consider the best home version ever made, the Dreamcast release. The problem? It launched exclusively in Japan through a mail order service. Not only did you need a Dreamcast, but you also needed access to a Japanese exclusive release. The version itself was excellent, featured restored bonus games, extra speed settings, and arcade accuracy that surpassed the PlayStation and Saturn ports. Unfortunately, most players outside of Japan never had the opportunity to experience this game. Years later, Super Turbo continued appearing on compilations like the Capcom Classics Collection and the 30th Street Fighter Anniversary Collection, which I'll let you know when it gets here, which is honestly how many modern players experience the game today. These releases made one of the greatest fighting games ever made far more accessible than it had been during the 1990s. So while Super Turbo may be considered the definitive version of Street Fighter 2 by many fans, actually finding the best version of it back in the day wasn't always easy. Depending on where you lived and what hardware you owned, your experience could be drastically different. But as we move along, it's time to look at, was this game a massive success for Capcom? Well, in Japan, it became one of the biggest arcade games in '94, second to only Virtua Fighter during its launch period, before eventually becoming the highest grossing arcade game in the country that year. It would even continue performing strongly into '95, proving that Street Fighter 2 still had plenty of life left in it despite being several versions deep at this point. The story was similar in North America. Super Turbo had become one of the top earning boards of '94 and remained a fixture in arcades everywhere. But at this point, Street Fighter wasn't just a popular game anymore. It had become a complete phenomenon. Players were learning matchups, mastering combos, spending countless hours trying to prove they were the best in their local arcade. Critics were equally impressed. Reviewers praised the faster gameplay, the introduction of super combos, and the addition of Akuma. Many considered it the definitive version of Street Fighter II, taking everything that worked in World Warrior, Champion Edition, Hyper Fighting, and the new challengers, and combining it into one complete package. What I find interesting is that for many fans, this wasn't just another update. This was the version. The version people remember playing in arcades, the version that would dominate tournaments, and the version that many players still return to today. And honestly, that created a unique problem for Capcom. How do you improve a game that many people already consider perfect? For years, Capcom would continue re-releasing Street Fighter II in various collections and ports, keeping the game alive for new generations of players. But then, in 2008, they decided to do something different. Instead of simply porting the game again and again, Capcom partnered with Udon Entertainment and gave Street Fighter a complete visual overhaul while preserving the gameplay fans loved. And now, this brings us to the remake of Street Fighter II. Now, usually when it comes to remakes, I would just make an entirely separate video. But with Street Fighter II, that felt wrong. The whole point of this retrospective has been showing how one game kept evolving over the years. So it only makes sense that we finish this journey by looking at its remake. Before we get into the behind the scenes development though, fair warning, this is one of the rarest ways to play Street Fighter II today. Super Street Fighter II Turbo HD Remix was released digitally only and never received a physical release. To make matters worse, it was genuinely delisted from digital storefronts, meaning if you didn't buy it back then, getting your hands on it today isn't exactly easy. For some of you, this might be the first time you've ever heard of this version. For others, it's a forgotten piece of Street Fighter history. Either way, in 2008, Capcom decided to revisit what many considered the definitive version of Street Fighter II and give it a fresh coat of paint for a new generation. And honestly, the story behind how they did it was pretty fascinating. Back in 2005, David Sirlin was working with Backbone Entertainment as a producer on Capcom Classic Collection. During development, he would pitch several ideas to Capcom for future projects. Among those ideas were redrawn versions of Puzzle Fighter and Street Fighter II. Whether Sirlin's suggestions directly convinced Capcom to move forward with the projects isn't entirely known, but once Capcom approved them, Sirlin found himself leading the design side of what would eventually become Super Street Fighter II Turbo HD Remix. Now at first glance, remaking Street Fighter II sounds simple, just redraw the graphics in high definition and call it a day. But that wasn't Sirlin's goal. His goal was to preserve the original Street Fighter II Turbo while also creating a second version that addressed the balance problems that players have been discussing for years. The challenge was that Street Fighter II had already achieved legendary status. To many fans, it wasn't just a classic fighting game, it was the fighting game. As soon as players heard the balance changes were coming, the backlash started. Many longtime fans argued that Super Turbo couldn't be improved. Others worried Capcom was going to simplify the game and remove the skill that made it so beloved in the first place. Sirlin disagreed. After years of watching high-level tournament play at events like Evolution, he believed many of the game's execution barriers didn't make the game deeper, they simply made it harder for new players to participate. His philosophy was that fighting games were ultimately about strategy, decision-making, and reading your opponent, not struggling to perform special moves. Instead of replacing the original game, Sirlin proposed a compromise. HD Remix would include two separate ways to play. The first was HD Classic Arcade Mode, designed to recreate the original Super Turbo experience as faithfully as possible. The second was a HD Remix Mode, featuring balance adjustments, gameplay refinements, and character tweaks intended to make matchups more competitive, while still respecting the foundation that made Super Turbo great. It was a smart move because it allowed Capcom to preserve one of the greatest fighting games ever made, while simultaneously experimenting with ways to improve it. Now, when it comes to the gameplay of HD Remix, the first thing you need to understand is that Capcom wasn't trying to replace Super Turbo. Instead, they wanted to give players two different ways to experience it. If you recall from earlier, the first option is Classic Mode. This is essentially the original Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, brought forward into the modern era. If you're someone who grew up in the arcades and wanted the game exactly as you remembered it, this was the mode for you. The second option was HD Remix Mode. This mode contains all of the balance changes that David Sutherland and the development team spent years working on. The goal wasn't to reinvent Street Fighter 2, but rather smooth out some of the more frustrating matchups and make the roster feel more competitive overall. Visually, this is where the game stands out the most. Every character sprite, stage background, and piece of artwork was completely redrawn by Udon Entertainment. Instead of the original pixel art, the game now featured a hand-drawn HD artwork while still preserving the same gameplay and animations underneath. For those who prefer the original look, Capcom even included the original switch back to the classic arcade visuals. Another major addition was the online multiplayer. Keep in mind, this was 2008, so being able to jump online and challenge players around the world in Street Fighter 2 was a huge deal. The game featured ranked matches, player matches, and even a feature called Quarter Match. Quarter Match was designed to recreate the feeling of an arcade. Players could spectate ongoing matches and instantly jump in when it was their turn. It was almost like putting a quarter in the machine and waiting to challenge the winner. It's a small feature, but one that perfectly captured the spirit of what made Street Fighter 2 special in the first place. For newer players, the game also included a training mode with hitbox displays. This allowed players to see exactly where attacks connected and understand why certain moves worked the way they did. While this might seem normal today, back in 2008, it was a fantastic learning tool for anyone trying to improve. So overall, HD Remix feels less like a remake and more like a celebration of everything Street Fighter 2 had become. It respected the original game while adding modern features that helped bring it to a new generation. Now, when actually playing HD Remix, what surprised me the most was how much restraint the developers showed. It would have been easy to completely reinvent Street Fighter 2, but instead they focused on preserving what already worked. Even with the brand new HD visuals, the game still feels like Super Turbo. The animations remain familiar, the pacing feels familiar, every fight still carries that same tension that made the arcade version so addictive. This wasn't Capcom trying to turn Street Fighter 2 into Street Fighter 4. It was Capcom taking a beloved fighting game and giving it a modern presentation. The biggest gameplay changes come from the character balancing. Fighters who were previously overlooked suddenly became much more viable. Some special moves were made easier to execute, certain matches were adjusted, and several characters received quality of life improvements that encouraged players to experiment with fighters they had ignored for years. What I appreciate most though is that the game never sacrifices its challenge. HD Remix may make some techniques easier to perform, but victory still comes down to spacing, timing, and matchup knowledge, and reading your opponent. You can't button mash your way through Street Fighter 2. The game still demands you to learn it. Now, while the gameplay changes were definitely the headline attraction, there was another thing I noticed when playing through the roster. Capcom actually went back and expanded several of the characters' endings. Some of them were small additions, others completely changed how we view the character's journey after winning the tournament. Since we spent the entire retrospective talking about these fighters, I think it's only fair we see where the HD remake leaves them. So let's compare some of the original endings to their updated counterparts and see what these new scenes add to the World Warriors. Starting with the leading man himself, Ryu. In the original Turbo ending, after winning the tournament, the awarded ceremony is held with Sagat taking third place and Bison taking second. Yet when everyone looks for the champion, Ryu is nowhere to be found. Rather than staying for the applause and recognition, he has already left to continue his training, practicing his Shoryuken beneath a waterfall. It's a simple ending that reinforces what we've known about Ryu ever since the beginning. He doesn't fight for fame or glory, he fights to improve himself. HD Remix expands that idea. Instead of immediately returning to training, Ryu visits his master's grave and reflects on the opponents he faced throughout the tournament. Even after defeating the strongest fighters in the world, he still wonders if there are even greater challenges waiting for him somewhere. Rather than feeling fulfilled, he remains hungry for the next battle. What I like about this updated ending is that it gives us a deeper look into Ryu's mindset. The original ending showed us that he values training more than fame. HD Remix explains why. To Ryu, the pursuit of strength is a lifelong journey, and no victory is ever enough to satisfy him completely. Next up is Ken, Ryu's longtime rival and best friend. In the original ending, moments after defeating Bison, Ken is reunited with his girlfriend Eliza. The two embrace, and before you know it, the ending cuts to them walking down the aisle. It's a wholesome conclusion that shows while Ken enjoys fighting, his heart has always been with the people he loves. HD Remix takes that concept and pushes it further. Ken openly admits that he has realized there's much more to life than fighting. The wedding sequence is expanded, showing that friends like Ryu and Guile attend the ceremony. Then 2 months later, we see Ken and Eliza shopping for baby clothes as they discuss whether their future child will be a boy or a girl. What makes Ken's ending so interesting is how perfectly it contrasts with Ryu's. Both men trained under the same master, entered the same tournament, and became 2 of the strongest fighters in the world. Yet, while Ryu continues searching for the next challenge, Ken chooses family and a life beyond the ring. Neither path is wrong. They simply found fulfillment in different places. Now, let's talk about Chun-Li. In her original Street Fighter 2 ending, defeating Bison finally allows her to avenge the death of her father. After the battle, she returns to China and visits his grave, telling him that he can finally rest in peace. It's a quiet, emotional conclusion to a story that had driven her throughout the tournament. By the time we get to Super Street Fighter 2, and sorry I forgot to cover this, Capcom gives players a choice. Chun-Li can either return to a normal life or continue her career as a detective. What's funny is no matter which option you choose, a group of thugs eventually learns the hard way that they're messing with the world's warrior champion. One path shows Chun-Li trying to settle down while the other shows her continuing to work in law enforcement. HD Remix takes this idea one step further. Once again, both endings are present, but the message changes slightly. Whether Chun-Li chooses a normal life or continues as a detective, she realizes something important. She will never truly stop fighting. It's part of who she is. Even after avenging her father, Chun-Li remains someone who stands up for others and confronts injustice wherever she sees it. What I like about this update is that it shows her growth. The original ending was about revenge. The HD Remix ending is about purpose. Chun-Li is no longer fighting because of her past. She's fighting because it's simply who she has become. Next up is E Honda. In his original ending, Honda returns to Japan after proving to the world that sumo wrestling belongs in the greatest fighting styles on earth. Rather than celebrating his victory, he gathers his students and reminds them that winning a tournament doesn't mean the journey is over. He tells them that true strength comes from keeping the body and mind in harmony through constant training and discipline. HD Remix keeps this ending largely intact, but expands upon it slightly. Honda once again returns to his students and delivers a similar lesson about never becoming complacent. He emphasizes that no matter how successful you become, there's always room to improve. After all of the wisdom and the philosophy, he wraps things up in the most E Honda way possible, telling everyone to eat up and get back to training. What I find interesting about Honda's ending is that unlike many of the other characters, winning the tournament doesn't really change him. He entered the competition to prove the value of sumo wrestling, and once he accomplished that goal, he immediately returned to what he loves. The HD Remix enforces that Honda's greatest victory was never defeating Bison, it was earning the respect for his craft. Next up is Zangief. In the original ending, after defeating Bison, he's greeted by the former Soviet president, who congratulates him for making his country proud. Naturally, the two celebrate in the most over-the-top way possible by performing a traditional dance together. It's one of the funniest endings in the entire game and perfectly fits Zangief's larger-than-life personality. But in HD Remix, it takes the character in a slightly different direction. Rather than focusing entirely on comedy, the ending shows what happens after Zangief returns home. 2 weeks after the tournament, he is approached by a wrestling promoter who claims to run the largest wrestling organization in the world. Seeing an opportunity to represent his country's style of wrestling on a global stage, Zangief accepts the offer. 1 month later, he makes his grand entrance before a packed arena. What I like about his ending is that it actually gives Zangief some character growth. In the original version, the joke is simply that Zangief wins and dances with the former president. Here, his victory opens the door to a new career. It reinforces the idea that Zangief isn't just a fighter who enjoys throwing people around. He's someone who wants to represent his nation and prove the strength of wrestling style to the entire world. Now we move on to one of the most heartfelt stories in Street Fighter, Blanka. In the original ending, after defeating Bison, an older woman suddenly runs towards him and asks him if he is her long-lost son Jimmy. At first, Blanka doesn't recognize her, but she noticed the anklet he's wearing and immediately realizes the truth. The two embrace, and for the first time in years, Blanka is reunited with his mother. HD Remix expands this reunion and makes it even more emotional. Rather than melting immediately after the tournament, Blanka's victory is broadcast around the world. His mother happens to see him on television and recognizes him. 2 weeks later, the two reunite at an airport. Unlike the original ending, Blanka immediately recognizes her and calls her mother. The focus is no longer on discovering who he is, but finally on coming home. What makes this ending work so well is that it reminds us that beneath the green skin, sharp teeth, and electric attacks is still Jimmy. For years, Blanka was presented as this wild beast from the jungle, but his story has always been about family. The HD Remix ending emphasizes that his mother never cared about what he'd become. The only thing that mattered was that her son had finally returned. Next up is Guile, and honestly I think HD Remix gives him one of the biggest improvements out of the entire cast. In the original ending, after defeating Bison, Guile grabs him by the throat and finally gets a chance he's been waiting years for. He demands answers about what happened to Charlie Nash back in Cambodia. Bison remembers everything and even taunts Guile, telling him to finish the job. Just before Guile can take him out, his wife and daughter arrive and remind him that killing Bison won't bring Charlie back. Realizing it right, he spares Bison and returns home with his family. HD Remix changes one important detail. This time, Guile makes the decision himself. Nobody has to stop him. He looks at Bison and realizes that, unlike the dictator, he's not a murderer. 3 days later, he visits Charlie's grave and family comes to terms with something that they've been eating away at him for years. Revenge is never going to heal that wound. What I really like about this version is that it gives Guile agency. In the original ending, his family prevents him from making a terrible mistake. In HD Remix, Guile reaches that conclusion on his own. He admits that his obsession with revenge nearly cost him everything, including his relationship with his family. With the Chandelure gone and his quest complete, he finally decides to focus on being the best husband and father he can be. It's a much stronger conclusion to his story and arguably one of the best endings in the entire game. Now we move over to India to take a look at Dasim. In the original ending, after defeating Bison, he simply returns home to his family. The ending then jumps ahead 3 years, where his son asks about a picture hanging from the wall. Dasim looks at it and calmly explains that it belonged to a past life. It's a peaceful ending that reinforces how detached he is from worldly accomplishments. HD Remix keeps that same peaceful spirit, but expands on what Dasim has actually learned from the tournament. 3 years after the competition ends, he returns to his village and speaks with one of the elders. While the prize money will certainly help his community, Dasim explains that the greatest thing he gained was insight. Watching fighters push themselves beyond their limits made him realize there are still lessons he can learn through yoga and self-improvement. The ending then reunites him with his wife Sally and his son Dada. After hearing how seriously Dada has been practicing yoga, Dasim even begins to wonder if his son may one day surpass him. What makes this ending stand out is that it perfectly fits Dasim's personality. Most characters win the tournament and gain fame, wealth, revenge, or closure. Dasim gains wisdom. Even after becoming one of the strongest fighters in the world, he remains focused on learning, teaching, and helping others. In many ways, he may be the most content character on the entire roster. Now let's get into Balrog. In Champion Edition, Balrog's ending is exactly what you could expect from the former heavyweight champion. After winning, he delivers a speech about the American dream and presents himself as this inspirational success story. It's honestly pretty funny when you remember this is the same guy who spends most of his time punching people in the face for money. In the Super Street Fighter 2 ending that expands on that idea, after becoming the strongest fighter in the world, Balrog receives exactly what he always wanted: wealth, fame, success. The tournament victory launches him into a life of luxury, and for a while it seems like he finally made it. Now, when we look at the HD remix, however, shows us what happened afterwards. As it turns out, Balrog is absolutely terrible with money. Rather than investing his fortune or planning for the future, he spends it as fast as he earns it. Within a few months, the millions he accumulated through the Chandelure are gone, and he's right back where he started, broke, frustrated, and looking for another opportunity. What I like about this ending is that it feels completely in character. Balrog's story has never been about honor or self-improvement. It's always been about chasing money and success. The fact that he immediately burns through his fortune and decides to train for a comeback feels like the most Balrog thing imaginable. Some characters learn lessons after winning a tournament. Balrog learns absolutely nothing. Next up is Vega, arguably one of the most narcissistic characters in fighting game history. In Champion Edition, his ending is simple. After winning the tournament, Vega proclaims that the ugly deserve no mercy and boasts about destroying them all. It's short, cruel, and perfectly establishes his obsession with beauty. Super Street Fighter 2 doubles down on that personality. After becoming champion, Vega returns to his mansion and spends his time admiring both his strength and his appearance. In fact, the ending goes as far as to paint him as one of the biggest narcissists on the planet. By the time we get to HD Remix, things take a darker direction. Vega reflects on how easy it was to prove that beauty equals strength, having grown bored of carrying out assassinations for the Shadaloo. He bids a farewell to Bison and returns home. However, rather than seeking peace, he begins contemplating a return to underground cage fighting where he can freely indulge his violent tendencies. As he straps his claw back on, he laughs to himself, declaring that blood red is the perfect color. What makes this ending interesting is that it reveals who Vega really is when nobody is giving him orders. In the original endings, he comes across as vain and arrogant. In HD Remix, we see that underneath all that beauty and elegance is someone who genuinely enjoys violence. He's not just obsessed with looking perfect. He takes pleasure in carving apart anyone he deems unworthy. It's a much darker ending, and one that fits him surprisingly well. Now we get to Sagat, and honestly, I think he received one of the strongest character improvements in the HD remix. Back in Champion Edition, Sagat's ending revolved entirely around Ryu. After reclaiming his honor and proving himself once again, he awaits for the day he can face Ryu in a rematch. He even points to the scar across his chest as proof that he survived his greatest defeat. Everything about his character at this point is driven by that loss. Super Street Fighter 2 pushes this even further. Sagat finally reclaims his status as the strongest fighter in the world, but now he fully understands how dangerous Ryu truly is. He swears that he will never underestimate him again and vows that their next battle will be fought to the death. HD Remix takes Sagat's story in a much more mature direction. A week after the tournament, he reflects on his obsession with revenge and realizes that his hatred towards Ryu had blinded him to the true purpose of martial arts. Rather than training out of anger, he returns to training because he genuinely wants to become stronger. He still wants to fight Ryu again, but now it's no longer about revenge. It's about testing himself against a worthy rival. What I really appreciate here is that Sagat finally evolves beyond the guy who hates Ryu. The original endings were all about anger and a wounded pride. The HD Remix ending shows a warrior who has finally accepted defeat and learned from it. Instead of wanting Ryu dead, he wants their next encounter to be the greatest match in history. That's a much more interesting character overall. Now we go to the big bad himself, M. Bison. In Champion Edition, Bison's ending is exactly what you'd expect from the leader of the Shadaloo. His army spread across the globe, nations fall under his control, and anyone who opposes him is wiped out. Standing atop his empire, Bison proudly declares, "Thank you, the world is mine." It's a pure villain fantasy, and honestly fits him perfectly. Super Street Fighter 2 follows a similar path. With all opposition crushed, the world falls into darkness under Bison's rule. The ending leaves the audience with the question, if Bison truly conquered everything, who could possibly stop him? By the time we get to HD Remix, this essentially turns the idea up to 11. This time, there is no lingering questions and no hints of resistance. Every world warrior, every new challenger, every possible threat has been eliminated. Bison sits atop the world, as the undisputed king of darkness, fueled by psycho power and completely convinced of his own supremacy. As he grins menacingly, he declares once again that the world belongs to him. What I find interesting about Bison's ending is that unlike characters like Sagat or Guile, he never changes. There's no lesson learned, no growth, no self-reflection. Each version of his ending is simply Bison achieving absolute power and enjoying every second of it. In a strange way, that consistency is what makes him an effective villain. While the heroes grow and evolve, Bison remains exactly what he has always been, a power-hungry tyrant who wants to rule the world. Next up is T-Hawk, whose story has always been one of the more personal ones in Street Fighter. In the original ending, after defeating Bison, Hawk finally gets the chance to confront the man responsible for destroying his homeland. When he asks why the Shadaloo drove his people away, Bison's answer is chillingly simple: because he could. After dealing with Bison, Hawk returns to his homeland and vows to rebuild what was lost. HD Remix expands this confrontation significantly. This time, Bison explains that Hawk's homeland simply happened to be useful for their plans. The people living there were nothing more than obstacles in their way. Hawk responds by promising that the Thunderfoot tribe will reclaim their land and the Shadaloo will never again threaten the people. A week later, Hawk returns home with the rest of his tribe, looking over the damaged land. He notes that despite everything they did, the spirit of the Thunderfoot remains unbroken. Drawing strength from his ancestors, he vows not only to restore the land itself, but also the people who call it home. What I appreciate about this ending is that it shifts the focus away from revenge. In the original version, the story is mostly about confronting Bison. In HD Remix, the real victory is reclaiming the future of the Thunderfoot tribe. It's less about defeating a villain and more about preserving a legacy. Now we move on to Fei Long. In the original ending, after defeating Bison, a movie director approaches him, impressed by his fighting skills and eager to make him a movie star. For most people, that would be a dream opportunity. For Fei Long, he turns it down without hesitation, choosing to focus entirely on his martial arts training instead. HD Remix expands on that decision and gives us a better understanding of who Fei Long is. Rather than returning to the spotlight, he steps away from acting altogether and rejects every offer that comes his way. During an interview, he explains that the fame is not what he wants to be remembered for. Instead, he wants to be remembered as a martial arts teacher. 1 year later, we see the result of that choice. Fei Long is now training students in the art of Hiten Ryu, passing down everything he's learned to the next generation. What I like about this ending is how it separates Fei Long from the Bruce Lee arts type he was originally inspired by. While the movie star comparisons are obvious, HD Remix emphasizes that Fei Long values martial arts above celebrity status. At the end of the day, he'd rather leave behind a legacy of discipline and knowledge rather than fame or fortune. Now we head over to Jamaica to check in with DJ. Back in the day, after defeating Bison, this finally gives him the inspiration he's been searching for. Combining the rhythm he found in the battle with his love of music, DJ creates an entirely new style of sound that turns him into a global superstar. Before long, he's performing in front of a sold-out crowd around the world. HD Remix takes that same idea and expands on it. 2 weeks after the tournament, DJ returns home and begins recording the rhythm he experienced while fighting. What starts as inspiration quickly turns into massive success. Within 6 months, he's touring the globe, selling out arenas, and releasing an album that goes double platinum. When asked about the secret behind success, DJ credits the tournament itself. To him, the battles, the energy, the excitement became the foundation for his music. What I enjoy about this ending is how perfectly it fits DJ's personality. While most of the roster enters the tournament searching for revenge, redemption, or glory, DJ shows up looking for inspiration. And somehow, he's one of the few characters who gets exactly what he wanted. It's a simple ending, but it's not hard to smile seeing him turn a fighting tournament into a successful music career. Now we jump into Cammy. In the original ending, after defeating Bison, she finally confronts him about her mysterious past. Bison claims that he tried to prevent the accident that caused her memory loss and even goes so far as to suggest that they were once lovers. But remember, Delta Red didn't buy that, and they quickly convince Cammy that Bison is manipulating her. The team then heads home together in a helicopter. But when we look at the HD remix, this completely changes the tone of the scene. Rather than making vague claims, Bison directly addresses her as Killer B and reveals the truth about her origins. According to him, Cammy is a clone created using his DNA and was once one of his most loyal assassins. Even though Cammy refuses to believe him, Bison warns her that she can never truly escape her past. Afterward, Cammy discusses everything with Colonel Wolfman and the rest of the Delta Red. What follows one of the most heartfelt moments in the game. Wolfman tells her that regardless of where she came from or what she once was, Delta Red knows her as a teammate, a friend, and a member of their family. 1 month will pass and Cammy is seen back in action alongside Delta Red, fully embracing the life she has chosen for herself. What I admire about this ending is that it transforms Cammy's story from a mystery into one about identity. The original ending leaves her past unresolved. HD Remix gives her answers, but more importantly, it shows that those answers don't define her. Whether she was once Killer B, that doesn't matter. What matters is who she chooses to be now. Now we move on to the last character I'll be covering, and I do owe a quick apology. While covering Super Turbo, I completely forgot to talk about Akuma's ending. Considering this is the game that introduced him to the world, that's a pretty big omission on my part, and I'll say my bad. In the original Super Turbo, Akuma has actually two different endings depending on who he defeats. If he defeats Bison, the ending is incredibly simple. Akuma remains standing in his victory pose, almost as if defeating the leader of the Shadaloo wasn't even worth celebrating. However, if he defeats another Akuma in a mirror match, he grabs his doppelganger and finishes him off with a devastating blow, reinforcing the idea that there can only be one true master of the Satsui no Hado. Now, HD Remix expands on this concept and gives Akuma a little more characterization. After defeating Bison, Akuma openly mocks him, calling him a fool for allowing Psycho Power to control him. In Akuma's eyes, true strength comes from mastering your darkness, not becoming a slave to it. Having proven his point, Akuma simply walks away into the shadows without another word, returning to his endless pursuit of strength and waiting for the day a worthy opponent finally emerges. It's a fitting end for Akuma. Unlike the rest of the cast, he's not fighting for revenge, justice, fame, or even world domination. He's fighting purely to test himself and become stronger, and once the battle is over, he moves on without hesitation. Now, unlike every version of Street Fighter 2 we've talked about so far, HD Remix never received a physical release. There was no cartridge, no disc sitting on a store shelf, and no collector's edition. You couldn't pick it up at your local game store. This was a digital-only title, which in 2008 was still relatively a new concept for major fighting game releases. Before launch, Capcom held an open beta beginning on June 25, 2008. Players who purchased Wolf on the Battlefield Commando 3 on Xbox Live were granted access to the beta, which allowed them to play as only Ryu and Ken on a single stage. The goal wasn't to show off the game, it was to stress test the online infrastructure. Capcom has seen the complaints surrounding the online performance of previous Street Fighter releases and wanted to make sure HD Remix got it right before launch. After gathering feedback and fixing the issues, the beta was extended all the way until September that year. The full version finally released on November 25, 2008 for the PlayStation 3 through the PlayStation Network. The following day, on Xbox Live, it was released for the Xbox 360. Europe will also receive the game a few months later in February of 2009. And here's where things get a little sad. Because HD Remix was released exclusive through digital storefronts, it eventually disappeared when licensing agreements expired and Capcom moved on to newer collections. Today, unless you purchased the game back when it was available, tracking down a legal copy is incredibly difficult. There was never a physical version to preserve, and it never returned to modern storefronts. So in a strange way, one of the most celebrated versions of Street Fighter 2 has become one of the hardest versions to actually play. That is, unless you already own it, have access to an old console to download it, or venture into preservation communities online. HD Remix is essentially a lost piece of Street Fighter history. And it's a shame because, as we're about to see when I talk about how people received it, people absolutely loved this game. For a game that was essentially a remake of a 14-year-old fighting game, Turbo HD Remix was met with overwhelming praise from both critics and longtime fans. The game currently sits in the high 80s on Metacritic across both the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, which is impressive considering how difficult it is to modernize a classic without upsetting the people who grew up with it. Critics praised the HD Remix for striking a balance between preserving what made Super Turbo legendary while also making thoughtful adjustments that improve accessibility and competitive balance. IGN awarded the game an 8.7 and an Editor's Choice Award, praising its deep gameplay and refined online functionality and gorgeous visual overhaul. Games Radar went even further, giving the game a perfect 10 out of 10, calling it essential for anyone who appreciates fighting games. One of the biggest compliments HD Remix received was that it respected the original game. Players could enjoy the brand new HD Remix balance changes or simply switch back to classic mode and experience Super Turbo almost exactly as it existed in the arcades. That flexibility helped win over many fans who were initially skeptical about changing such a beloved competitive fighter. The online functionality was heavily praised. Remember, this was 2008 and online fighting games were still trying to figure things out. HD Remix offered ranked matches, player matches, online leaderboards, spectator features, and a much smoother online experience than previous Street Fighter releases. For many players, this was the first time they could consistently play high-level Street Fighter 2 opponents from around the world without needing to visit an arcade. Commercially, the game was also a success. Despite being a digital-only title, HD Remix shattered records for downloadable games at the time, breaking first day and first week sales records. Within a month of release, the game had already surpassed 250,000 paid downloads, proving that there was still a massive audience for Street Fighter 2's nearly 2 decades after its original debut. Perhaps the greatest compliment HD Remix received was that many fans considered it the definitive way to experience Street Fighter 2. It preserved the gameplay that made the series legendary while modernizing nearly every aspect surrounding it. But as successful as HD Remix was, it would also serve as a reminder of something important. No matter how many times Capcom revisited Street Fighter 2, players always wanted to know one thing: what's next? After nearly 2 decades of updates, revisions, ports, remakes, Capcom was finally ready to move on with the franchise once again. Now, before we wrap up Street Fighter 2 as a whole, it's worth mentioning that Capcom wasn't finished re-releasing these games. Over the years, the company bundled multiple versions of Street Fighter 2 together into collections, allowing newer players to experience the evolution of the series without needing several different consoles or arcade boards. One of the notable examples was Capcom Generations 5 Street Fighter Collection 2. This released for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. This collection included the original trilogy of Street Fighter 2 updates, the World Warrior, Champion Edition, and Hyper Fighting. What made this collection interesting wasn't just the games themselves, but the extras. Players could browse character profiles, artwork, strategy guides, and unlockable content that celebrate the history of the franchise. Each game also featured arcade versus, training modes, while clearing the games unlocked additional features such as arranged soundtracks and special challenge modes. Perhaps the coolest addition was the Super Versus mode, which allowed players to select characters from different versions of Street Fighter and pit them against each other. Ever wonder how Hyper Fighting Ryu would stack up against Champion Edition Guile? This mode finally let players answer those kind of questions years before Capcom would revisit the idea in later releases. Collections like this become increasingly important because Street Fighter 2 had grown into something far larger than a simple game. By this point, there wasn't just one version of Street Fighter 2, there were multiple versions, each with their own balance changes, mechanics, characters, and dedicated fan bases. These collections ensured that the legacy of Street Fighter 2 remained accessible long after the arcade era had ended, allowing a new generation of players to experience the game that helped define competitive fighting games. As we move along, in 1997, they released Street Fighter Collection for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, a compilation that focused on the later years of Street Fighter 2 era while also bridging the gap into the Alpha series, which we'll be getting into in another video. This collection included Super Street Fighter 2, the new challenges, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, an enhanced version of Alpha 2 known as Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold. Unlike some of the earlier collections, this wasn't just trying to tell the entire story of Street Fighter 2. Instead, it focused on what Capcom considered some of the most competitive and feature-rich entries available at that time. For the Street Fighter 2 games, players received arcade-accurate conversions complete with arcade versus option modes. One nice quality of life addition was that hidden characters such as Akuma were much easier to access than they were in the original arcade releases. The collection also featured versions of Super Turbo that were slightly less brutal than the arcade counterpart, making them a little more approachable for home players. Reception for the collection was somewhat mixed. Critics praised the arcade effect quality of the ports, and they agreed that Super Turbo remained one of the greatest fighting games ever made. Some felt Capcom should have included more Street Fighter titles. Despite those criticisms, the collection still performed well with fighting game fans. Electronic Gaming Monthly awarded it both Fighting Game of the Year and Best Compilation in 1997, with editors noting that despite all the advances the genre had made, they still believed the classic Street Fighter games represented the pinnacle of competitive fighting games. Now, if you've been following my channel since the first Street Fighter video, this collection should sound familiar because I actually used it in my Street Fighter 1 retrospective. In the mid-2000s, Capcom began releasing a massive series of retro compilations known as the Capcom Classics Collection. Rather than focusing solely on Street Fighter, these collections were designed to preserve Capcom's arcade history as a whole. The series spanned multiple releases, including Capcom Classics Collection, Capcom Classic Collection Volume 2, Remixed, Reloaded, and even the Game Boy Advance exclusives Mini Mix. Between all of these, players could access dozens of classic Capcom titles ranging from Final Fight to Ghosts and Goblins and Strider, Captain Commando, and of course Street Fighter. For Street Fighter 2 fans, the most important release was the original Capcom Classics Collection. Included in Volume 1 were the first 3 major versions of Street Fighter 2, the World Warrior, Champion Edition, and Hyper Fighting. These weren't just simple ROM dumps either. The collection included artwork gallery, strategy guides, music players, character profiles, and unlockable bonus content that celebrated Capcom's history. Then came the collection Volume 2, which added another major piece of Street Fighter history, Super Turbo. This meant players could now access the original Street Fighter, the early Street Fighter 2 trilogy, and Super Turbo across the different Capcom Classic releases without needing to hunt down arcade boards or consoles. The PSP releases expanded things further. Capcom Classics Collections Reloaded included World Warrior, Champion Edition, and Hyper Fighting, essentially putting the Street Fighter 2 trilogy into your pocket years before handheld retro collections became common. Meanwhile, Remix focused more on Capcom's arcade catalog and the original Street Fighter rather than Street Fighter 2. Looking back, these collections were incredibly important. Long before digital storefronts, anniversary collections, and modern retro compilations became the standard, Capcom Classics Collection was one of the earliest ways for an entire generation of players to experience fighters' history. And now we arrive at what might be the ultimate love letter to Street Fighter 2. In 2003, Capcom celebrated the 15th anniversary of Street Fighter franchise with Hyper Street Fighter 2, the Anniversary Edition. Rather than creating another balance update or adding new characters, Capcom asked a much more interesting question. What if every version of Street Fighter 2 existed in the same game? At its core, Hyper Street Fighter 2 is built upon Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but before selecting your character, you're asked to choose which version of Street Fighter 2 you want to play. Want to use the original World Warrior version of Ryu? You can do that. Prefer Champion Edition Guile? That's an option. Want the Hyper Fighting Chun-Li, Hyper Street Fighter 2 Cammy, or Super Turbo Akuma? They're all here. Each version isn't just a costume or alternate color palette either. The game faithfully recreates how that character functioned during that specific point in Street Fighter 2's history. Their moves, damage values, animations, portraits, voices, and gameplay quirks are all preserved. As a result, Hyper Street Fighter 2 features 17 unique fighters, but an incredible 65 different character variations. This means that players could mismatch their competition like it was nothing. The home versions even included more bonuses. Players could swap between CPS1 and CPS2 soundtracks, use remixed music from previous home ports, and even watch an edited version of Street Fighter 2, the animated movie. For longtime fans, it felt like Capcom had gathered 15 years of Street Fighter history into one package. The game originally launched for the PlayStation 2 before receiving an arcade release shortly afterwards. Interestingly, This arcade version would become the final game ever released on Capcom's legendary CPS2 hardware, bringing an end to one of the most important arcade platforms in fighting game history. By 2018, Street Fighter had become one of the most popular fighting franchises in gaming history, and Capcom wanted to celebrate that legacy properly. So on May 29, 2018, they released the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and PC. Unlike previous collections that focused only on a handful of games, this was designed to be the definitive museum of Street Fighter's arcade history. The collection featured 12 arcade-perfect titles spanning the franchise's first 3 generations. Starting with the original Street Fighter from '87, players could experience every major version of Street Fighter 2, including World Warrior, Champion Edition, Hyper Fighting, Super Street Fighter 2, and Super Turbo. For the first time, many of these games were brought together under one roof with modern features. Players could create save states, jump into online rank matches, build custom lobbies, browse character biographies, listen to music tracks from across the series, and even explore a massive museum packed with concept art, development documents, and sprite sheets in a timeline chronicling Street Fighter's history. Perhaps the biggest addition was online play. Hyper Fighting, Super Turbo, Alpha 3, Third Strike featured online matchmaking, allowing players around the world to compete in some of the greatest fighting games ever made without needing an arcade cabinet. Now, there were a few omissions. Hyper Street Fighter 2 didn't make the cut, but even with those absences, the collection represented the most complete package of the classic Street Fighter 2 titles. Critics responded positively, with review scores generally landing around the low to mid 80s. IGN gave it an 8.7 out of 10, GameSpot gave it an 8, and the collection would eventually sell over 1 million copies worldwide by 2019. By 2026, that number had grown to nearly 4 million copies sold. For modern players, the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection became the easiest and most accessible way to experience the franchise's roots. Instead of hunting down arcade boards, rare collections, or aging hardware, fans could trace Street Fighter's evolution from 1987 all the way to Third Strike in one passage, so that overall includes Street Fighter 2. And honestly, if you're looking to play the classic Street Fighter games today, this is probably where I'd recommend starting. Now, the final version I'm going to mention here, yes, the final version, can you believe I said that, is Ultra Street Fighter 2, The Final Challengers, released exclusively for the Nintendo Switch in 2017. Now, I didn't do a deep dive on this one because honestly, I don't have a Nintendo Switch. If I did, I probably would have a lot more to say about it, but from everything I've seen and heard, this was Capcom's attempt to give Street Fighter 2 one last update for a brand new generation. Reception to Ultra Street Fighter 2 was generally positive, though not nearly as enthusiastic as HD Remix. Most critics praised the updated visuals, it had online functionality, and the inclusion of Evil Ryu and Violent Ken. However, many questioned the game's premium price tag, especially considering that most of the content had already existed in previous versions of Street Fighter 2. The Joy-Con controls also received criticism. The Way of Hadou was often viewed as more of a novelty than a must-play mode. Still, despite the mixed reactions, Ultra Street Fighter 2 serves as a reminder of just how enduring Street Fighter 2 truly is. More than 25 years after the original arcade release, Capcom was still finding new ways to bring these characters, stages, and rivalries to new audiences. And honestly, that's probably the greatest compliment you can give Street Fighter 2. Very few games remain relevant for decades. Street Fighter 2 didn't just remain relevant, it kept getting re-released because people never stopped playing it. And there you have it, an immortal game. The fighting game that simply refuses to die. Truthfully, when you look at Street Fighter 2, you start to realize that all of these updates were really the beginning of how games are made today. Look at modern fighting games. You have balanced patches, DLC characters, story expansions, and constant updates. But back in the early 90s, there was no internet. There was no way to patch a game through a server. If Capcom wanted to make changes, their best option was to release a new version of the game. And trust me, this is a trend you're going to see again throughout the Street Fighter Takeover. I'm also a firm believer that game preservation is one of the most important things in gaming today. It's one of the reasons older games have become so expensive. But if there's one game that has been preserved better than almost any other, it's Street Fighter 2. And honestly, it deserves that respect. Now, I have a confession to make. This was my first time truly diving into Street Fighter 2. I know, shocking. And I'm sure I butchered a few names throughout the video, so please show me a little mercy in the comments section. But I can honestly say this. After going through what felt like 700 versions of the same game, I am exhausted. Believe it or not, this video took me nearly 2 weeks to make because I wanted to make sure I got it right and actually had something to talk about. And after today, I have something to talk about. I will never complain about Mortal Kombat having 3 versions ever again. All jokes aside, this is one of the most important games in fighting game history. Street Fighter 87 was a niche arcade title that almost faded into obscurity. Street Fighter 2 transformed it into a global phenomenon and helped create a franchise that still thrives over 30 years later. The fan base exploded because of this game. The characters became icons, the music became legendary, and to this day, people are still cosplaying these characters at conventions around the world. At the drop of a hat, you will see them. So not only was Street Fighter 2 immortal, it was also impactful. Understand this, without Street Fighter 2, there's no Mortal Kombat, there's no King of Fighters, there's no Killer Instinct, there's no fighting game boom of the 90s. That's the kind of impact we're talking about. So if you're a retro game collector, dust off that controller. If you own a 30th anniversary collection, fire it up and take a trip down memory lane. Because regardless of which version you play, Street Fighter 2 is one of those rare games that remains just as cool as today as it was back then. The only thing that truly bothers me is that the HD remix is still trapped in the past. Out of all the versions I played for this retrospective, that one ended up being my favorite. So if anyone ever asks me which is the easiest, most enjoyable version of Street Fighter 2 to experience today, my answer is going to be the HD remix. Unfortunately, actually getting your hands on it is easier said than done. But overall, do I recommend Street Fighter 2? Absolutely. Just be prepared because this game doesn't just ask you to play it. It pulls you down a rabbit hole. And before you know it, you're comparing 7 different versions of the same game and wondering how Capcom managed to keep re-releasing Street Fighter 2 for over 3 decades. And somehow, some way, we are still playing it. Proving my statement overall, Street Fighter 2 is the immortal classic. If you made it to the end of this video, first, thank you. This was a heck of a ride we just went on. But hey, it was very important in talking about the history of Street Fighter overall. I can say, if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to leave a like. It really helps smaller channels like mine grow and tells YouTube that this content is worth sharing with other retro gaming fans. And next week, we will dive into Street Fighter Alpha, a new portion into the Street Fighter Takeover series. If you want to be there when the video drops, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss it. And if you're feeling generous, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. Link is in the description. With that said, this is the Retro Phantom, signing out.